Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. Today I have a little treat for you all, and that is the last exotic weapon tier list video I'm ever going to make for Destiny. Lots of you have been requesting this for months now, but since it's the last one, I've taken a bit of care to ensure that my version is backed by a lot of testing and objective analysis. Plenty of weapons in Destiny, especially newer ones, get a lot of momentary hype where people will swear by them after they watch one video and then completely stop using them a year later. As such, I don't want to be swayed by fleeting crowd opinion for a list that I hope to be evergreen. If you're new to this channel, a few warnings for you. First, this is not your typical YouTube tier list. Not to spoil anything, but this is going to be a very bottom-heavy tier list. The top few tiers are only going to be reserved for the very best weapons. Additionally, this is also a tier list for specifically endgame PvE and endgame PvE alone. Challenges like Master Lomans and Solos, 5 feet raids, speedruns, GM Vanguard alerts, and perfecting DPS. As such, a lot of weapons that might normally feel powerful in lower stakes content will tend to fall off heavily as things get harder. Lastly, please consider these rankings within the context of the global sandbox. A lot of the lower tier placements are actually weapons that are individually pretty solid, but lack a real solid niche to fit themselves into given Destiny's final sandbox conditions, from content to play speed to the artifact. As for what's on screen, you'll notice a couple things that are different this time around. Since it's the last one, I've decided to re-rank every single exotic weapon using the old tier maker format instead of narrating over the spreadsheet for entertainment value's sake. In the interest of not making a 6-hour-long video, I'm also not explaining what each exotic does and focusing purely on analysis. But since I don't expect anyone to remember what all 141 exotic weapons do in this game, I brought out the Destiny Data Compendium, which will describe each ranked exotic's function at a highly detailed level. Finally, let's talk about the tiers themselves. We have 7 of them this time, from S to F. The way I make tiers is by starting at the top and identifying clearly different groups of weapons on the way down. For example, this tier list originally only went up to E tier, but there were clearly weapons that were worse than others in the E tier, so I split the tier in two and made an F tier. You can read the tier headings, but they aren't a guaranteed one-to-one description of what the tiers contain with how different exotic weapons are from each other. The best way to think about them is usage brackets. S tier contains weapons that are omnipresent in endgame content, while each tier below represents lower and lower usage and viability rate groupings, with E tier representing essentially zero real usage, and F tier being worse than modern legendary equivalents, while also lacking power generally. There are some exotics that are technically worse than legendary competitors, but because in the grand scheme of things their power level isn't that low, they escape the F tier for this reason, and you'll see why that makes sense when we get to certain exotics. Now, without further ado, let's get to the actual tier list, beginning with Ace of Spades. Now, Ace of Spades is mathematically better than a good Legendary Kinetic 140 with its 68% damage perk as well as buffed Firefly, so I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. No real use case for this thing in endgame PvE, but technically it is more exotic than a typical Legendary hand cannon. Next, we have Ager's Scepter. Ager's Scepter, decent for ad clear for sure. Doesn't really scale too well into, lower level content or lower power level content. I will say the main use for Ager's Scepter in endgame content is when you need something like a trace rifle. So it cannot be a primary, it has to be a special. And you need a trace rifle because you need to shoot objectives. So for example, Root of Nightmares has a lot of shooting objectives in mechanics. Specifically, the nodes really benefit from having something like a trace rifle on, as opposed to something like a sniper or a shotgun or a fusion rifle or a grenade launcher, anything like that. You really want to be shooting these nodes with something with a high fire rate, so trace rifles come into play. And the best trace rifle for general, subclass build independent ad clear when it comes to +0 like easy level content is going to be Ager's Scepter. So it's used in those instances, and even then it's not used universally. There's other weapons that are used in those instances. And so yeah, decent ad clear. Not anything really worth your exotic slot generally speaking, especially with our final artifacts. Ager's Scepter is not necessarily the best trace when it comes to damage profile, so it really has a limited use case, but it is a role that technically does exist in endgame content. You might see it in Ron speedruns or Ron challenges, and so I'm going to go ahead and put it into the D tier. Next, we have Alethonym. So Alethonym here has a couple use cases. First of all, it is the only primary movement tool in the game. I will say it is a little bit overrated for a movement tool for like micro missile stuff because it does a lot more damage to you than something like a gizmo. And a lot of the time, endgame players will not really tend to run out of kinetic special ammo unless they're doing some sort of challenge beforehand where they're on like a shoot to loot explosive payload kinetic hand cannon or something like that. So it's not actually that common that you run out of kinetic ammo. The other use cases though, slow guaranteed ammo gen on hit. Ammo gen on hit basically doesn't exist in this game, so Alethonym is pretty unique in that regard. And on top of that, people used it on like day ones, for example, on transitions where you would like stick a boss or something like that. I could see it being used in like a speedrun or a challenge to generate guaranteed ammo on hit. It's also used to like stun Taniks, I believe. If you like shoot Taniks at the right time when he's trying to move, he'll like get stunned or something like that. So actually sticking enemies, it has some endgame use cases. And then of course for actually movement, besides the vertical movement, you can actually use it for horizontal movement if you grapple to the Alethonym projectile, something that's kind of been picking up steam in speedrunning for some specific strategies. Alethonym grappling is definitely quite a fast movement tech. And so as a result, I'm going to go ahead and put this in the C tier. Definitely some uncommon use cases, but definitely more defined than the stuff that we're going to see in the D tier. Next, we have Anarchy. So I'm going to go ahead and Control F to Anarchy right here. We have Anarchy. So Anarchy, known for a couple things, right? Two things. The first thing is obviously for boss damage. For a total damage tick option while you do damage with other specials, for example, it is a better option than Finality's Auger. Finality's Auger does have better super gen, but that's not really relevant these days in the current sandbox. So Anarchy is the choice if you want to do something like Anarchy Sniper. That's going to fare better than Finality Sniper. Now, that being said, Anarchy, I'm not going to lie to you, in endgame content, especially in more optimized content, I've failed to see a use case for really running Anarchy Sniper. Maybe if you're the Tractor player and you're swapping your debuff extending with your energy slot, you're running like Conspiracy Honed or something. But even then, that's kind of a bit of a stretch. So really the endgame use case here is going to be maybe that, occasionally that, and then also for trapping doors. In speedrunning, there is nothing that can really trap doors in the same way that Anarchy can. 6 separate bolts, they all last fairly long compared to like Ares and Isle or Witherhoard. And of course, you can have them all up simultaneously. So yeah, Anarchy, pretty decent stuff here. I'm going to go ahead and put it into the C tier. Similar viability to Alethonym, a bit more mainstream, but maybe less common in those mainstream use cases. And that'll be that. Next up, we have Arbalest. So I have to scroll up here a bit. So Arbalest, unfortunately, has been completely power crept for at least stunning champions, right? Barrier champions, a third of the legendaries already do that. You have other exotics that are plenty capable of stunning barriers. So really, you're not going to be using this to stun barrier champions. And outside of stunning barrier champions, its efficiency in slot in like roam content is pretty terrible. Its damage profile is awful. Even being supported by something like Particle, it obviously doesn't stack Particle very quickly. And the disruption break effect that it applies is not very relevant, especially given that its own damage profile is pretty terrible. And so the only thing this thing is really used for in endgame content is for breaking boss level shields in one shot or close to one shot. So this is something like Ghost of the Deep, or maybe something like Callous Final Stand. These are all kind of kinetic shields that can be broken very quickly by Arbalest, and spoiler alert, Microcosm as well. And so Arbalest is used maybe more than Microcosm in some of these instances because it's not a heavy weapon. And so in a lot of fireteam environments where you can afford to have one person be on Arbalest and then do damage with a legendary heavy or swap exotics really quickly, this is definitely viable and maybe best in slot for that specific use case. And so because it has a real use in endgame content, even though the weapon generally, for its intended purpose, I would say, is not very useful, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the D tier. Okay. Next up, we have Bad Juju. Bad Juju right over here. Now, Bad Juju has been known as like the super generator, right? It's very, very enemy efficient. Like per enemy, you get a lot of super gen. Unfortunately, in a sandbox where we have Elemental Supercharger, where we have stuff like, Enhanced Dealer's Choice, there's not really a reason to use Bad Juju anymore. I would say Bad Juju is actually more underrated for its general ad clear profile. A lot of people see this thing as just like a single target weapon that's really good at just farming super. In fact, it's not the best at farming super compared to some other stuff that we have in the sandbox now, but its actual ad clear profile as like a general pulse rifle is not bad. And so I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. It's definitely not worse than a legendary pulse rifle equivalent for the most part. It definitely has its own use. However, that's not a real endgame use case, given that if you want to play more optimal, there are even legendary options that can generate more super than Bad Juju. Okay, next up we have Barrow-Dyad. Barrow-Dyad is a Strand SMG. Unfortunately, this thing's synergies kind of begin and end there. It doesn't really have any access to like Unravel or Sever on its own. And so really you're just going to be relying on the artifacts to give it those properties through like Unraveling Orbs or something like that. And this thing's damage profile is okay. It's pretty decent for an exotic primary, but its main use was with PKs, and PKs has been nerfed into the ground, so obviously for boss damage it's not great. And even when you're using it with PKs, this is a weapon that invites you to manually reload it so you can get those Blade Seekers prepared. That's how most of its damage comes out. And unfortunately, PKs are most optimally used when you're not reloading your SMG, so it's a bit of anti-synergy there. However, it is just, base damage profile wise, I would use it over a legendary SMG if I was like forced to, compared to some other options that we're going to talk about that are going to end up in the F tier, where they're literally just worse than a legendary SMG. Like if I could run triple exotic or something like that, and I had to run an SMG, I might use Barrow-Dyad. However, there's some exotics that are going to be in the F tier, like I just mentioned, that are definitely not going to meet that kind of requirement. And so I'm going to go ahead and put Barrow-Dyad into the E tier. Exotic feel for sure, but no real use case for this thing in endgame content. Next up, we have Bastion. Now, Bastion's fallen off a little bit in recent times. It's actually, I suppose, a decent sustained option. Let's go ahead and look at its damage profile in the sustain tab on my spreadsheet. You'll see here Saint's Fury includes melee time. This includes the Catalyst as well. Around 4k DPS with 120,000 total damage. That's not that great. You know, even Lord of Wolves is higher than that. Lord of Wolves is kind of a neglected pick after its nerf. There's a lot of stuff here that is just, you know, going to be better special-wise than something like Bastion. And so for damage, this thing has really lived and died on the viability of grapple melee stuff and melee damage strategies. And so for roam content, you know, it's okay at dealing with mini-bosses, you know, something like a Totems encounter in like Pantheon or just regular like Master King's Fall or something. You know, killing the ogres, killing the mini bosses, it's not bad at that, right? It's certainly not bad at that. I would say Merciless is better, but for a kinetic slot option, it's not bad. You can argue there's better options, but in a particle season or with particle artifact mod, it's not bad, right? But really this thing's main appeal has always been for melee strategies, for damage strategies, involving hitting those pellets, activating Saint's Fist, and getting that massive melee damage bonus. Unfortunately, you know, grapple melee has been kind of nerfed quite a bit. And so the main usage for this is going to be in something like a Vow speedrun, where you might be doing a 1-floor caretaker with Into the Light and relying on Bastion to get a really high-powered grapple melee off the one time. Obviously, it's consumed after one grapple melee, so this is mainly for like burst grapple melee damage. Already kind of a niche technique, and these days, now that grapple melee has been nuked, it is really only useful in maybe just caretaker, to be honest, maybe Rolk. And so yeah, Bastion, I'm going to go ahead and place it into the C tier. It's definitely got a little bit more punch, a little bit more of a legacy than the stuff in the D tier. And I can see it being definitely more situationally useful than the stuff in the D tier, but it's definitely a lower half of C tier type of exotic. Next up, we have Black Talon. So Black Talon, I'm going to go ahead and Control F my way over there. So Black Talon is a, you know, void projectile sword, shoots out those double tracking slashes that apply suppress. Unfortunately, this thing is downright terrible. It's going to go straight into the F tier. The awful damage profile for boss DPS, just worse than the majority of legendary swords. For roam content, I guess suppress on hit is not like the worst thing ever, but there are other sources of suppress like Tractor and Suppressing Glaive that don't require you to run Black Talon and obviously have a lot more utility than Black Talon. This thing's Catalyst doesn't even work, by the way, the thing where you can get some 10% damage stacking, multiplicative stacking for every single void debuff on a target. Straight up just doesn't work, by the way. Straight up just doesn't work. Even if it did work, it would still have a terrible damage profile. So Black Talon is literally more of a detriment than a legendary sword in the vast majority of cases, and so I've gone ahead and put it into the F tier. Next up, we have Borealis. So Borealis, we're going to Control F our way there again. Borealis is basically one of the fundamentals type of weapons. It has Arc, Solar, and Void modes, and it has that 30% damage increase. So in theory, the damage per shot is not bad with Ionic Return. You can stack like 2 different buffs on this thing. Unfortunately, in roam content, compared to like a redirection sniper, if you really cared about stacking a lot of damage onto a single shot of a sniper, it's not like better. It's not better. And the elemental shield break refund thing, it just almost never comes up. So this thing, I would basically never recommend it for endgame content. There's no real reason to use it. Even for like niche stuff like breaking Tormentor's shoulders or something, like there's other exotics that you would rather use over this 100 times out of 100. And so I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. Next up, we have Buried Bloodline. Buried Bloodline has a bit of a solo player legacy as the only non-subclass, non-set bonus, non-ability way of getting Devour in the game. Obviously, there's a lot of options now in the artifact, and you can use like Brawn 4-piece and whatever. But if you want specifically a weapon to give you Devour, and you don't have Devour access in your subclass, Buried Bloodline is going to be your guy. However, this is a pretty limited use case. Yeah, this is a pretty limited use case. It's definitely seen some use in solo challenges, like I mentioned. But outside of that, its damage profile is not very good. And just as a weapon compared to even like a legendary rocket sidearm, let's compare this thing to like Lotus Eater. For regular ad clear, you would definitely rather use Lotus Eater over Buried Bloodline. Buried Bloodline is the only rocket sidearm to not really have that splash effect that they typically do. And this is quite noticeable when it comes to endgame content. And so I'm going to go ahead and put Buried Bloodline into the D tier just because of its kind of solo legacy. I can definitely see some challenges where you might want to use Buried Bloodline, but for the most part, it's just going to remain in the D tier. But nothing too special these days, and definitely not of the pedigree of the stuff that's in the C tier. Next up, we have Centrifuse. Yeah, this thing is going straight into the F tier. Movement gimmick is pretty annoying to maintain, to be honest with you, and it's likely overshadowed by legendary arc autos. I think people that have used this weapon would likely rather use a snipe hunt, or would likely rather use something like a VS Pyroelectric Propellant 100 times out of 100 over this thing. It's a very gimmicky weapon, and even when you have its effect kind of triggered, the explosive damage is really not that high. And so in my opinion, yeah, just an F tier weapon. I think it is equal or worse than a legendary arc auto equivalent, especially with how strong those have gotten these days. And so we're going to go ahead and move on to Cerberus +1, which is right below it. Cerberus +1, let's go ahead and control F to that. This thing is a spread shot auto rifle. And the main thing with this is, the damage profile is you have essentially an auto rifle that has not the range of an auto rifle, but I guess, a bit of an increased damage profile to account for that. Unfortunately, compared to other close range, even legendary primary weapons, this thing loses out a little bit, especially when it comes to like splash damage and, subclass synergy. So pretty terrible on that front. The only reason this thing is going to escape the F tier is because there is some end game content where maybe you need a weapon that has some sort of spread shot high hit count. And so, for example, Callous Skulls, Cerberus is pretty good for that. You would certainly maybe take Cerberus over like a machine gun, but you would never take like a regular legendary auto rifle over a machine gun for a use case like that. And so Cerberus is going to escape the F tier just for that use case. I'm not going to put it in the D tier, even though technically it has maybe like a minimal role. That role is just way too minimal compared to the stuff in the D tier. But I'm just going to escape the F tier. I do not think it is worse than a legendary auto rifle in endgame content, just because of that niche that it has. Next up, we have a bit of a powerhouse, and that is, of course, going to be Choir of One. Choir of One. Hello, my old friend. I think when the dust has settled, people will acknowledge the fact that Choir is Destiny 2's greatest ever versatile ad clear tool. Nothing has really come close to it in previous years. I mean, now you could argue maybe like Dead Messenger. We can talk about that conversation in the A tier. And not to spoil things, but yes, I'm going to go ahead and put Choir into the A tier. Commonly best in slot. Choir isn't the best at a lot of things, right? When it comes to ad clear, maybe in speedrunning, it's not the fastest at killing a lot of enemies, surprisingly, right? Because the hipfire is a little bit slow. And the ADS mode obviously isn't capable of nuking a group of ads super quickly. You would use something like Tessellation or Heirloom or some sort of splash option for that. But Choir is just such a consistent, reliable, ranged option. Probably the most consistent, reliable, ranged option in the game. Unlike a lot of less traditional ad clear options that are closer in range, Choir has a lot of range. And so Choir of One is just, you can just kind of use it wherever and you'll have a lot of success. Not to mention the crazy artifact support that it has this season, from like targeting autoloaders, sustain fire, every void artifact perk under the sun. And so Choir of One, I think it's going to be an easy A tier. Unfortunately, it does take your exotic slot. So for a lot of challenge content, people will prefer to substitute it for like a worse ad clear weapon so that they can run like an exotic heavy or something like that. But that's not necessarily the fault of Choir, more the fault that it's a special weapon, I suppose. So yeah, I don't think anyone's going to be surprised by Choir's placement into the A tier. We've talked about it plenty on this channel before. Let's go ahead and move on to Cloudstrike. Cloudstrike, it's unfortunately outclassed by legendary snipers when it comes to raw damage. It does have a small use in speedruns, and that is actually starting Ron 3rd encounter by shooting a Scion in the head. The lightning strike that follows, that is called down, actually happens to perfectly time in to kill the next spawn of Scions in order to spawn the Centurions really quickly. So I'll give it a little tiny bit of credit for that and allow it to escape the F tier. I'm going to go ahead and place that into the E tier. But for boss damage, this thing, I mean, I'll literally show you. We can control F here, go to Cloudstrike. This thing is literally worse than modern just legendary snipers, right? 3.5k DPS. If we clear here and we go to specifically snipers, you're going to see basically every legendary sniper under the sun is higher than Cloudstrike, right? Outside of you'd see a triple tap 4 times Keen Thistle, which isn't really a real DPS option. So yeah, that's it for Cloudstrike. Let's go ahead and move on to Coldheart, which happens to be directly below it over here on the compendium. And Coldheart is the best sustained ionic trace source in the game. That is a superlative, but is that really useful in endgame content? I would argue not really. There's Delicate Tomb, which is a more consistent instant source of ionic traces, but doesn't require any buildup. And unfortunately, a lot of the time when you're hunting for specifically just like one ionic trace, you really want just one. A Delicate Tomb is going to be faster at generating that in an instant, on the go, compared to Coldheart. And when it comes to damage profile, Coldheart really kind of struggles, especially in lower power content. I've used Coldheart myself as an option with like Geomag Warlock, and unfortunately in Conquest level stuff, maybe like 5v raid level stuff, minus 50 stuff, it really tends to feel like, even with Harsh Refraction, which by the way, it doesn't even synergize with that well because it doesn't have like jolting feedback, it doesn't really do that much damage compared to a lot of the other trace hard hitters that we're going to talk about as we move further on into this list. So Coldheart, I'm going to unfortunately have to give it an E tier. It is the best at something, but that something is not particularly useful in endgame content, especially if you are trying to play more optimally. A lot of people who are running Arc, especially, for example, Sundered Doctrine, the speedrun strategy where you farm for like a Geomag Chaos Reach, people just use Delicate Tomb because it is a guaranteed ionic trace on like an elite kill, whereas Coldheart, you kind of need to do some sustained damage and maintain that energy mechanic, which is a little bit more annoying. Next, we have Collective Obligation, which is, in my opinion, a bit of an underrated weapon. This thing is capable of constantly cycling through all 3 void debuffs and just applying them on hit, not on kill, but on hit to enemies repeatedly. So this thing scales, because it's an on hit effect, into minus 50 level content if you choose to use it there. It has its own sort of damage buff through this Void Leech increased damage perk. And of course, in Season of the Void, right, we have some of the craziest Void artifact perks ever. This thing is just insane. And of course, the Catalyst with Repulsor Brace makes it even better for survivability. So I'm not going to tout this thing as like the best exotic primary in the game or anything. I do think it's a bit underrated and synergizes very well with the artifact. And so I'm going to go ahead and place it into the D tier. I think you'll find that this is kind of an appropriate placement for it, given that some of the other exotic primaries we're going to talk about are also going to land in similar placements. Next up, we have Conditional Finality. Ooh, okay, so this one is going to be maybe a bit of a kicker for some people here. But yeah, Conditional Finality, it's a Stasis Solar dual mode aggressive shotgun. Unfortunately, right, so this thing has good chunks and, high quality of life for roam content, but it's not really a crazy outlier when it comes to endgame behavior. And so I'm going to place it into the E tier, right? So it's exotic, but there's no real endgame use case for Conditional Finality, and let me explain why. So let's say you're using this thing for roam content, you're using it to kill champs, mini bosses, whatnot, right? Let's go ahead and take a look at this thing's damage against something like a champ or a mini boss. Conditional Finality, body, average across both shots. This is with max reload, by the way, with Lunafaction. So essentially shooting this thing at max fire rate, 3k DPS. Let's go ahead and look at the other shotgun options on this list. And you'll see that the vast majority of legendary shotguns, including very popular options like Found Verdict, absolutely dwarf this thing when it comes to damage profile, and they're not even exotic, right? But I'm not going to put it in the worse than legendary tier, because obviously the exotic feel of Conditional Finality, the ability to freeze instantly on hit, that is useful. That is useful in some respects. However, in endgame content, when you are playing to really optimize your loadout, make sure in-slot efficiency is very high, Conditional Finality doesn't bring enough to the table, in my opinion, for most endgame builds, especially in most endgame content, to really push it into the D tier where I can say that it has even a minimal role in endgame content. Because Ager, Scepter, Arbalest, Barrow Bloodline, we've talked about these 3 weapons, and we've pointed to specific things in endgame content where you can say these weapons do this thing better than anything else. You can't really say that for Conditional Finality. I don't think there is a use case for it. And so it is a cool weapon, don't get me wrong, it's one of Destiny's coolest weapons ever, but I don't think it has a real niche in endgame content that you can really point to. All right, next up we have Crimson. Crimson is one of the most vanilla Destiny exotics ever. Unfortunately, I'm going to go ahead and put this thing into the F tier. No splash perks. The regen and the kill restoration thing is not that impressive in the current sandbox. The Catalyst does essentially nothing in PvE. The only reason this was ever used in endgame content was for Lucky Pants pre-stacking for specifically Uncivil Discourse, and now that that's been nuked into the ground, this thing is just completely irrelevant. So Crimson, F tier, worse than Legendary. I think that's pretty uncontroversial. Next up, we have Cryosthesia 77k. This one's going to go in the E tier because technically, like, a legendary stasis sidearm is incapable of doing like this freeze shot every single kill. Is there an instance where I would take this over like a legendary sidearm in the same way that I would take Barrow-Dyad over like a legendary SMG? I suppose. But certainly this thing has no real use case in endgame content. Let's go ahead and move on to Cull's Shadow. Cull's Shadow, maybe the newest Destiny exotic, the one that came from that Ablation mission, which is pretty cool. This one, yeah, there's 2 main things this is used for. So first is, for those of you that don't know, Cull's Shadow applies a DOT effect that is actually quite long and quite frequent. And so you can use it for envious swapping with something like a crossbow. You can use it as an alternative to Witherhoard for DOT, and someone else can use Witherhoard, and you guys won't have any sort of conflict with each other when it comes to those ticks for envious. And so Cull's Shadow is an option for that. The second option that people probably know it more for is the frontal blades, the melee that it attacks with, that little 1-2 combo, does stack with melee buffs, right? It stacks with combination blow, it stacks with Worm God. And so I've seen some successful builds with Cull's Shadow that appear to do more roaming DPS than something like a glaive melee build. And so if you're willing to give up your exotic for this, I think it's not the worst. It's not the worst. It's certainly, there are builds that if you build enough into them, they are endgame, minus 30, minus 40 viable compared to like a standard glaive melee build. And so it does require a lot of building into. There's a lot of other weapon exotics on this list that don't require as much build crafting. But because it does have some endgame utility with that crossbow stuff that I mentioned, as well as decent viable melee builds, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the D tier. Okay, next up we have DARCI. So DARCI is a bit of an interesting one. DARCI is, the galley of legendary snipers. Unfortunately, Galley is something like a 24 to 26% buff to legendary rockets, and of course also provides a massive ad clear bonus to those rockets as well, whereas DARCI is a, depending on the sniper type, 13.5 to 16% damage increase to legendary snipers, and so unfortunately it's a lot lower. And if you actually do the math and you compare a DARCI plus 5 like A499 compared to 6 A499, the difference is extremely minimal, not something you're going to notice. And I think a lot of fire teams would agree that DARCI, it doesn't really feel like you're doing a lot more damage when you have a DARCI in your team compared to not. And so I'm going to go ahead and actually put DARCI into the C tier. Uncommon use case, I would say an optimized, very optimized sniper DPS fire teams. You would maybe have 1 DARCI and 5, regular snipers, especially with Conspiracy, it's a bit more noticeable. But yeah, DARCI, I don't know, compared to Galley, the actual damage utility of this thing, especially for ad clear, it's a lot lower, right? It's a lot lower. And snipers, you could even argue, are not necessarily top of the meta right now. You have stuff like crossbows, you have rockets, that are a little bit stronger when it comes to optimal gameplay. And so DARCI, it's definitely useful, but the damage profile itself is not that great. It's really just used for the damage buff. And I suppose if you're a Destiny scientist, you can use it to find some health percentages as well if you're not using like DDT or something. So yeah, DARCI has some uncommon use cases, some endgame viability, certainly better than the D tier stuff. I would definitely say it's more viable than like an Arbalest, but certainly maybe not as high as you might think if you know how DARCI works in endgame content. Okay, next up we have a Dead Man's Tale. Unfortunately, Dead Man's Tale suffers from the curse of being a aggressive scout rifle, so it's single target, and with no splash damage perks, right? So even though this thing's damage profile is not bad, with max cranial spike stacks, it's actually pretty decent at killing ads, right? It kills ads fairly quickly, even in harder content, but this thing has minimal synergy with the artifact, and it is a single target weapon, and it's a scout rifle. Honestly, I think the vast majority of even scout rifle lovers would rather use a solid legendary scout, like for example, like the Equilibrium Scout, over this thing, especially given the state of the artifact. And so I'm just going to go ahead and put this thing into the F tier. I think it's just generally worse than legendaries, especially when you account for the fact that, you have shoot to loot Withering Gauge, shoot to loot explosive payload. You have that sort of utility, which is not afforded to you by Dead Man's Tale, even though DMT, I believe, does get shoot to loot. It obviously doesn't get explosive payload. So that's it for DMT. Let's go ahead and move on next to a recent fan favorite, Dead Messenger. Dead Messenger, I remember on this channel we did some testing, and on stream we found that all 3 waves are simultaneously able to do damage to enemies in PvE. And so yeah, Dead Messenger, they kept the behavior for PvE despite patching it in PvP, which was pretty nice of them. And so this has become a very large outlier when it comes to doing individual chunk damage to maybe like a mini boss, even in high level content, because it does 3 wave frames worth of damage and has a consistently easy to activate 30% damage perk that's basically constantly up. And so yeah, has demo, has turnabout, has decent catalyst. And so Dead Messenger, I think it's just very, very consistent. Compared to Choir of One, if you're dealing with grounded targets, as long as you don't need to shoot objectives, because obviously Dead Messenger is a GL, it's not very good at shooting buttons. But if you don't need to shoot any buttons, Dead Messenger is arguably a better ad clear weapon than Choir is. Like the hipfire mode on Choir is like a little bit, inaccurate, it's a little bit splashy. Dead Messenger is pretty exact. If you're used to using waveframe, it's an excellent waveframe, the best we've ever gotten for just raw ad clear potential. And so yeah, Dead Messenger, I'm going to go ahead and place it into the A tier. It is also a lot more higher ammo gen than Choir of One. That's very notable. Choir of One is like, I think, sub 20 or sub 30 ammo gen. This thing is like 70. So yeah, definitely a big difference when it comes to ammo gen. Very, very excellent ammo economy. The only difference is Choir is obviously a lot more versatile. This thing is just for killing groups of ads or mini bosses that are grounded. Choir 1 is basically for anything you want, but it's going to be a little bit worse when it comes to the minor DPS department. Okay, next up we have Deathbringer, and unfortunately Deathbringer, it's been outclassed completely by legendary rockets and other exotic rockets, other exotic easy options when it comes to boss DPS and for ad clear. I mean, I don't think anyone was really ever using it for ad clear because it's a little slow for that. It's cool. It's a cool exotic, cool effect. And so I'm going to place it into the E tier. It's technically worse than legendaries, but like I mentioned earlier at the intro of the video, the power level of this thing is not that low. If you look at the actual DPS number in the spreadsheet here, we're going to go to Deathbringer. 5k DPS, and this is a little sim bait because, it's assuming your max reload canceling very quickly. But yeah, 5k DPS is certainly not bad, right? It's not terrible. And so you're not like throwing if you're using Deathbringer. It's obviously not as good as like Hezen or like maybe swappable Dawn Chorus, Dragon's Breath, but it's not like terrible. So I'm not going to put it in the F tier. You could use it in endgame content, yes. All right, next we have Delicate Tomb, which we mentioned actually fairly recently when we were talking about Coldheart. So Delicate Tomb has a guaranteed Ionic Trace on elite kill. It also has 100% damage buff and Jolt on hit, which is pretty nice. You don't have access to that on Coldheart. And so yeah, Delicate Tomb, even though it has a worse ammo economy than Coldheart, is arguably more useful just because of how instantly it can generate an Ionic Trace. And so I'm going to go ahead and put Delicate Tomb into the D tier. It certainly has a minimal role. We've seen it in speedruns, for example, being used against something like Zoetic Lockset, whereas Coldheart, kind of iffy on that compared to Delicate Tomb. And so I think that's fairly self-explanatory. Next up, we have a Deterministic Chaos. So I've seen some recent YouTube content on this thing because it recently got target lock. And Target lock, does not help this thing's cause at all. So first of all, if you want to use this with Actium Warwick, I suppose Target Lock is not bad, but this thing, its whole, I mean, you'll see it on the compendium guide, literally notes this down here. Its whole concept is like anti-synergistic with itself. Target Lock wants you to keep firing weapons, but releasing the trigger after firing a Vexadecimal projectile refills your ammo. So you kind of have to use Actium Warwick if you want to really get Target Lock beyond the 100% mag requirement. And the actual Vexadecimal projectiles, where you inflict weaken, only inflicts weaken when it's supposed to if you release the trigger, which is kind of counterintuitive to how the weapon works, right? Because you're supposed to hold down the trigger to constantly cycle through its effects. I want to say this right now, even if this weapon worked correctly and it applied Vexadecimal, the weakened projectile every 16th shot, and maybe it had some sort of effect that allowed it to refill while shooting with Target Lock, I would still place it where it belongs, which is in the F tier. There's so many strong Void LMGs that we have this season that synergize better with the artifact, that have better damage profiles, that are more useful in general, that have insane origin traits. There's no reason to use Deterministic Chaos over these weapons. And so I'm going to go ahead and place it in the F tier. I think it is strictly worse than legendary weapons when it comes to any sort of endgame content. And in endgame content, let's be real, like even LMGs are not even doing that well to begin with. And so that's certainly not helping, Deterministic Chaos's cause. Okay, let's go ahead and move to the next weapon on this list, which is going to be Devil's Ruin. Devil's Ruin, it spawns a Fire Sprite on kill. I don't believe it bypasses the global Fire Sprite cooldown, so it's not super useful in that respect. It has a Pyrogenesis effect, which is kind of cool, which is boosted further by Collective Action, which it recently got as a catalyst. And the Pyrogenesis thing is cool. Unfortunately, due to the global Fire Sprite cooldown, as well as it not being a super lethal weapon in its normal mode, you're not going to be having Pyrogenesis up that often. And, its animations and all of its effects that it has to go through to get this Pyrogenesis effect, compared to some of the other exotic primaries that we've already talked about and soon will talk about on this list, the uptime is just too low. And so I'm going to go ahead and place it into the E tier. Certainly the effect is exotic in nature, for sure. There's no doubt about that. But does it have a real use case in endgame content? Absolutely not. Next up, we have an absolute classic that's been with us for many, many years now, and that is, of course, Divinity. So Divinity, it's very useful on certain bosses for precision strategies, which are certainly not the least popular thing ever these days. And Divinity, its ability to just instantly create a nice big crit cage. Divinity is actually fairly decent for sustained damage for the Divinity user now. I think they something like doubled its effective DPS with the changes to its penance, with the changes Focus Fury, Jolting Feedback Catalyst, Harsh Refraction. All of these things combined, I think Divinity is, it's actually not too bad, right? It's a 2.2k for a consistent debuff option. That's not terrible. Right? That's similar DPS to non-Actium 4 times a charm target lock Retrofit Escapade, which is a cool benchmark, I suppose, that you can look at. Or it's similar to like Barrow-Dyad just being shot on its own. Or it literally does more DPS than Max Nanite Outbreak in Outbreak's current state. So that's, I suppose, a little bit interesting. But regardless, distractions aside, Divinity is still useful on some bosses for creating that crit. It just creates consistency in a game where consistency is the name of the game for a lot of challenge content. And so I'm going to go ahead and put Divinity into the B tier. It certainly has a notable niche. It's not commonly best in slot. It doesn't have that high of a usage rate, especially given how popular like rockets and crossbows are, which don't necessarily need Divinity. But yeah, it's certainly a notable niche and certainly finds more use in endgame content than a lot of the stuff in the C tier. Next up, we have Dragon's Breath. I think Dragon's Breath is actually still fairly underrated by the Destiny community as a whole, especially the endgame community. This thing with Dawn Chorus actually does fairly good swap DPS. I'll be developing some rotations to test in the damage rotation ranking with Dragon's Breath. I think when you mention weapons like Anarchy and Finality's Ager, in the same breath, you should probably also be looking at Dragon's Breath, because it's also an auto-loading kind of tick heavy weapon that you can use alongside specials, as long as no one's stealing your ignition procs. And so Dragon's Breath, yeah, pretty decent weapon. It also has a global Fire Sprite cooldown bypass. So any kills that you get with Dragon's Breath will produce Fire Sprites without any sort of cooldown, which is pretty cool. Is that useful in endgame content? Maybe, right? I mean, you have stuff like Elemental Overdrive in the artifact. But, regardless, just as a swap DPS weapon, it's pretty decent. Ad clear-wise, it's a little slow for the current tempo of the sandbox. We're very lethal, very fast in the current sandbox. And Dragon's Breath is not exactly known for killing things extremely quickly in a group compared to something like a Galley. But, Dragon's Breath has some potential use cases. So I'm going to go ahead and put it into the D tier. I think it fits that description fairly well. Next up, we have Duality. Duality is actually surprisingly decent for damage. I'm going to go ahead and show you guys where it is in the spreadsheet over here. We're going to type Duality, and it's actually 5k. 5k DPS for a special. That's kind of like benchmark DPS, right? If you want to be a special weapon that does good damage, you should be doing around 5k. And so Duality is a very simple option, doesn't require any prep, doesn't require any stacking. All you got to do is do 3 body shot pellets into a bunch of crits, and you just spam crits at the boss. Super, super easy to use. Total damage is absolutely pitiful, but it's not bad. Right? And, you know, for roam content, it's not the best either. But Duality, just because of its raw damage profile being as decent as it is with as little setup as it requires, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the D tier. It's definitely a lower D tier option, but it's definitely decent. It's definitely decent. Next up, we have Edge of Action, which is right below that. That is, of course, the Bubble Glaive, or the Dome of Doom, as I believe some esteemed members of the community like to call it. The Bubble Glaive, the Edge of Action, has a couple use cases, right? So the first one is obviously it is a defensive tool. I don't think it's a very high tempo defensive tool. It requires stacking, and you know, when you don't have the bubble up, it's not exactly a useful glaive. It's kind of just a regular glaive with a repulsor brace, which is kind of whatever. But yeah, it has that kind of suppressing effect with Same 14, which is kind of interesting. But mainly, you know, it's like a defensive tool, which the Glaive Bubble, for what it's worth, does have, you know, very good survivability in even very low power content. So you could argue that it has some use there, but I think the uptime of the Glaive Bubble kind of has problems in some harder content, and you would certainly rather use a more offensive exotic in most content to be more independent from your teammates. And then the other use case for this weapon is that it provides a universal 5% stacking weapon damage buff to your teammates, something that's quite rare in this sandbox. And so unlike support auto, where someone has to be actively shooting you and it has like a short duration, the Bubble Glaive can actually be placed and swapped off of completely, giving you essentially a free 5% damage buff for your entire team. Now, they obviously got rid of the thing where you can break your own Bubble Glaive and then like the bubble effect kind of pretends to be there still, so that's kind of a little bit of a mark against this thing, but it certainly has endgame use cases that are more frequent than something like an Arbalest or a Buried Bloodline or even like an Ager's. And so I'm going to go ahead and put it into the C tier, definitely lower C tier, right? It's definitely more of an uncommon use case than something like Alethonym or Anarchy, but I would definitely want to give it some props, and I do think it's maybe a little bit flown under the radar for some of the groups in the endgame community. Okay, next up we have Edge of Concurrence. Edge of Concurrence is the Arc Hunter Glaive that makes the Lightning Seekers. Unfortunately, the Seeker does do a lot of damage, right? It does do a lot of damage, but unfortunately the uptime is way too low for endgame content. I'm going to talk a lot in the rest of this video about tempo and like the pace of play, and Edge of Concurrence is uptime for the modern sandbox where people are playing, you know, abilities are coming up as fast as they have ever come up, and you know, of course, our weapons are very, very lethal. It's just not fast enough. It's just not fast enough. And so I'm going to put it in the E tier. Like the Lightning Seeker is definitely like a lot of damage, and definitely decent, but it's just, you know, no real use in endgame content. Next, we have Edge of Intent, which is unfortunately going to be victim to the same fate here. It's more useful than Concurrence, I would say, in endgame content, but the uptime on the healing turret is honestly surprisingly worse than I thought it would be, and Cure ×2, Restoration ×2 only works if you have Touch of Flame equipped for the person receiving, like the person that is getting hit by the Seeker. If you have Touch of Flame, then you will get Restoration ×2 and Cure ×2, and sacrificing your exotic slot to get something that you can already obtain through either the artifact or through your fragments, through your subclass, whatever it is, through healing grenades, I don't think is that useful. Edge of Intent, especially like outside of its healing turret, unfortunately just as like a base roam weapon, it's kind of just a normal glaive. And even compared to legendary glaives, its perks, like it just has heal glaive, right? So its perks are not that great. And so as a result, I'm going to go ahead and put Edge of Intent into the E tier. I honestly thought this would have some endgame use when I saw its description when it first came out, but nobody really uses this thing in endgame content because the uptime is just too low, and players tend to value independence over like teammate support in endgame content. And so Edge of Intent certainly leans more in the latter direction over the former. Okay, next up we have Ergo, which is for some reason below Eriana's Vow, even though it's alphabetically before, but whatever. Ergo Sum. This thing is very versatile. It's very versatile. It's a multi-tool. It provides an alternative movement option. It provides add clear options through Arc Conductor. It provides the sword buff through Pack Hunter. Yeah, a bunch of stuff this thing can do. It's kind of jack of all trades, master of none, though, right? When it comes to sword DPS, though, I will say Caster Polaris with Dawn Chorus is, I believe, the highest sword DPS you can achieve in the game. So if we go ahead and we sort by swords here, right? Let's go ahead and filter by swords. You'll see, okay, I suppose Striker's, Striker's Surehand with Rampage Redirection is a little bit higher. And so is this simulated double hit, throw spam Praxic Blade. But these are both kind of like sim bait options. And then right underneath it, you have Caster Frame, the Perfect Fifth, Loosened Blades ×3, Pack Hunter, Transcendent, whatever, Dawn Chorus, Argent Blade, Ergo, right? 7k DPS, pretty impressive. This is certainly going to get tested more and more as we move deeper into the rotation testing, into those mines. But for now, yeah, Ergo, pretty solid contender, very versatile, very much a jack of all trades sort of exotic. And so I'm going to go ahead and put it into the B tier. Certainly overall in endgame content, you would use this thing more than something like an Anarchy if you're playing all facets of endgame content, but certainly not anywhere near as good as the stuff in the A tier, right? So certainly like lower B tier, let's just say. Next, we have Eriana's Vow. Eriana's Vow. This weapon used to see some use in endgame content for killing oracles and killing certain enemies for like Verity's Brow and stuff like that. Unfortunately, these days there's a lot of weapons that can do that. The only thing special Eriana's Vow has going for it is there's some solar shielded enemies in speedruns where you want to shoot them and create an ignition instantly. That's a nice effect to have. And the second thing for Eriana's Vow is that it takes the quality of life, you know, the low zoom of like a hand cannon and the model of a hand cannon, the clean model of a hand cannon, and allows you to have an easy barrier option that does like sniper damage for like phalanxes or something like that in a speedrun where you have to kill a bunch of shielded enemies pretty quickly, one by one. Eriana's Vow can be good for that. So while I did mention that it has some use cases, those use cases are, to be honest with you, kind of quality of life preference based use cases compared to some of the stuff in the D tier where it's like objective fact, where it's like these things are useful for this specific thing. I think a lot of people, like speedrunners, for example, use Eriana's Vow just because that's what they've used in the past. And it's like, you know, you could use another weapon there, but, you know, people just use Eriana's Vow in the past. And so people continue to use Eriana's Vow into the future. The only real thing is like the shield break ignition thing, which even then, in speedrunning, a lot of the time, relying on an ignition to kill enemies is just slower than just blowing the enemies up. So Eriana's Vow, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. It would be certainly higher up in the E tier compared to some of these other exotics, which you'll notice, by the way, these are just going to be alphabetically sorted. I'm not going to bother doing within tier arrangements because that would be a lot of work. And also, a lot of these exotics are so different from each other, even within one tier, that kind of trying to order them and make sense of them is just nonsensical. Okay, so Eriana's Vow in the E tier. We're going to move on to Euphony. Euphony, this is the Melito favorite right over here. Euphony, let's go ahead and look at its Destiny Data Compendium entry. So this thing with Pack Tactics is, you know, pretty good. It's probably the best Pack Tactics assistance weapon besides maybe like Service of Luzaku, but certainly it's a better weapon than Service of Luzaku on the whole. It's good sustained special damage. That's all I can say. Good sustained special damage, very good total damage. Catalyst unfortunately didn't do much for it, but if we go ahead and take a look at Euphony here, Euphony with a little bit of pre-stacking, I believe. Oh, sorry, yeah, no, this is with no pre-stacking. Actually hits 4.5k DPS with a hell of a lot of total. And if you include some pre-stacking and you're like on Strand Warlock or something like that, this hits a consistent 5k DPS, which again, 5k sustained and meeting duality while doing like triple the total damage if you start with higher stacks is pretty impressive, to be honest with you. So I'm going to go ahead and put Euphony into the C tier. Certainly more of an uncommon use case weapon, but you can't deny that, you know, on Strand Warlock, on Sanguine, it is a very, very good pairing there. And so it is definitely much lower in the C tier compared to some of the other options here like Anarchy and Alethonym and, you know, Bastion that have defined use cases. But certainly I would say the sustained damage outlier and just being such an easy, consistent option this season with Pack Tactics, I would say gives it a leg up over the stuff in the D tier. All right, next up we have Diris. Diris, this is a speedrunner classic right here. People used to use this thing all the time to die very quickly in speedruns. Unfortunately, Diris' self-damage was nerfed at some point, and so people tend to use like ricochet shotguns now. It is still used from time to time to kind of get yourself low in a speedrun just because it, like, you know, it's good at like impacting walls and stuff like that. I suppose you can use it to get amplified on kill, but it's not really that valuable of an asset these days, especially because a lot more people are playing Hunter in speedruns compared to Warlock, and jump height is not really that big of a deal these days with micro missiles and whatnot. So Diris has a very limited scope use case now, if at all. So I'm going to go ahead and place it into the E tier. Certainly the DPS and the ad clear are terrible on this thing compared to literally anything in the D tier, even some of the stuff in the E tier. So yeah, no real use, exotic feel, sort of. I suppose it had some use or potentially has a very small niche use case. So I'm not going to put it in the F tier, but yeah, certainly not a very endgame viable weapon these days. Okay, next up we have Eyes of Tomorrow. Eyes of Tomorrow is, I've honestly always been kind of a fan of this weapon because it's cool. Ever since they gave it like the 4 enemy kill refund thing, I've always thought that was kind of cool, just a chaining infinite heavy exotic. Unfortunately, getting 4 kills with this weapon, especially in fire team content, is kind of unrealistic. You can do it in like very dense strikes or something like that, but this is definitely a for fun weapon. I think Eyes of Tomorrow, despite the fact that I'm going to rank it in the E tier, which is probably not a surprise to you, because it is just worse than Legendary Rockets with Pack. Obviously, given that it's an exotic, doesn't have access to stuff like Perpetual Destruction, so it has literally like a step down compared to maybe some of the Legendary Rocket stuff. But I think Eyes of Tomorrow meets in the middle of like where a good exotic should be when it comes to how it feels. It's just like a clear identity. It's really, really cool. Even though the pace of this weapon is like very slow, it feels like visually there's a cool payoff, right? So I really like Eyes of Tomorrow. I think it's a really cool exotic. Unfortunately, that's not going to spare it from being in the E tier. It certainly has an exotic feel. And certainly you could argue that the whole like infinite ammo thing gives it some sort of benefit over like a Legendary Rocket. But certainly it's not going to be in the D tier. Certainly it does not have any real endgame use case. Not lethal enough, not consistent enough. Galley just mogs this thing. But I do like the exotic. So, in the E tier, let's go ahead and move on to Fafnir. Fafnir, interesting one, right? Fafnir, I think some people maybe would expect this to be higher. I'm going to go ahead and place it into the B tier. It's kind of like Div, right? There are some bosses where you would use Fafnir because you can't afford to tractor the boss. And maybe you don't have someone who's like Felon Jury on your team. So you need to use Fafnir. Fafnir is a very short debuff. It has half the duration, 5 seconds, compared to Tractor's 10. And on top of that, Fafnir cannot debuff immune. So if you're trying to really optimize damage and you want to use something like a Tractor, you can Tractor an immune target and then swap to Withering Gaze and like Galley or something like that and consistently debuff extend. Whereas Fafnir is your 30% source. You need to start with Fafnir. And not only is it worse for debuff extension because it's only 5 seconds, you can't have a weaken extend beyond 5 seconds. That's the timer itself. But on top of that, you need a boss to be damageable first. So your teammates have to wait a little bit for your Fafnir shot to connect before they actually do damage. If you're trying to optimize kills. And so unfortunately, that's not great, right? That's not great. So it's not going to be in the A tier. It's certainly not going to be in the S tier, but it does have a niche for like bosses like Witness, where if you want a 30% debuff that's consistently up, even though it's for a much shorter time than Tractor's total ammo is capable of producing, this is your only option. And so I'm going to go ahead and put it into the B tier. Very short debuff, can't debuff immunes, but it does have that ranged advantage over Tractor. All right, coming up next, we have Fighting Lion. So Fighting Lion actually has seen some use recently with Howl of the Storm builds. I'm sure you've seen it with like Weekend Clear in those builds, and it's pretty decent there. But outside of that niche, it has basically no use in endgame content, right? It's a primary GL that doesn't do very good damage. It does volatile on hit, but that's not super valuable. This thing was basically just used because in GM Vanguard alerts, some of them you literally start with no ammo. And if you start with no ammo, you kind of have to use Fighting Lion because it's a primary, right? So if you have to use a primary in those sorts of situations, then it's good. But outside of that, I think this thing's niche it's just too small, too situational to really place above the E tier. So I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. Certainly its use case in that one Vanguard alert like Stasis Titan strat is, it's definitely like the top of E tier, but I don't think it can really hang with stuff that has, very strongly defined, clearly defined, very small rules in the D tier. So that's kind of subjective, but I wanted to place it into the E tier. I think it would be a disservice to some of the weapons in the E tier and to some of the weapons in the D tier if I placed it into the D tier. So let's go ahead and move on to Final Warning. Final Warning is actually a pretty decent weapon when it comes to primary damage profile. It's actually not terrible for boss DPS either. I'm not saying you should use it for boss DPS, just to be clear, but it's not terrible for boss DPS either. If you use it correctly, which is like the 15 shot, 75% charge thing, it has, pretty decent damage. Unfortunately, it's a sidearm with a charge time, and like it does kill things fairly quickly, and we do have like a strand assistive artifact, but it's still not that great. It's still not that great even with all these things. The tempo of the weapon is simply just not fast enough for endgame PvE to be like super, super lethal. And so I'm going to go ahead and place it into the E tier. It's certainly better than a legendary sidearm in some cases, especially for single target damage. But compared to some of the stuff in the D tier that we're going to talk about, whether it's Collective Obligation or future exotics I'm going to place into the D tier, it's just not there. It's just not there, sadly. So in the E tier it goes. Next up, we have Finality's Augur. So Finality's Augur, like I mentioned before, is completely outclassed by Anarchy when it comes to sustained DPS. It's also more annoying to use than Anarchy, right? The turret lasts longer, but you have to proc bait, you have to create the turret, you have to change modes, you got to like paint the target, you got to be aware of when your turret dies, which Anarchy I think is fairly easy to know when your traps are blowing up, but Finality's Augur, you have to be like staring at your turret to know, or you have to have like a timer in your head to figure that out. So kind of annoying. On top of that, the turret, when you're not painting targets, if you're just using it to like watch over an area, it's not that great, right? The DPS against red bars, it's not amazing, right? You could argue it has some like synergy with like particle or whatever, but honestly, I don't think that's that big of a boon. So yeah, Finality's Augur, I don't think anybody's really using this thing unless they were using it for damage for like roam content. So yeah, not that great. The only thing Finality's Augur can claim to have that will save it from the E tier is that in some speedrunning content, you can place Finality's Augur turrets inside of doors. If you sit right at the door and aim straight down, the turret will actually shoot through the door, thus giving you the ability to kill enemies a little bit early compared to when you would normally be able to access them, specifically in like VoG confluxes. The strategy is to use Finality's Augur for this purpose, and so I will give it the bottom of D tier. Well, I mean, there's no bottom or top of tier, but in my head, I will give it the bottom of D tier for a small use case in endgame content. Otherwise, it is just worse than Anarchy, which is itself already struggling to find use cases for damage content specifically. Obviously, Anarchy has the door trapping thing, which I mentioned, but yeah, it's just worse than Anarchy in a use case where Anarchy is already floundering a little bit, in a sandbox where everybody is using crossbows and heavy snipers and levy, etc. Okay, next up, we have Forerunner. So Forerunner is a pretty high quality of life weapon. This thing is special because it has the highest precision multiplier of any weapon in the game at 5.2 times. The next highest is something like 3.5 times, or maybe like Izzy has like a pretty high crit multiplier with Honed Edge times 4. But yeah, pretty interesting stuff. So the thing about Forerunner is that the actual damage profile of the weapon itself, people used to use it to kill like Tormentors and stuff like that. These days, people have other options. No one really uses Forerunner for that. But yeah, people used to use it for crit stuff. Nowadays, the only thing that's a standout with Forerunner is actually the Rock Fragmentation Grenade. It does actually a lot of damage, and it gets boosted by grenade buffs. So stuff like Verity's Brow, stuff like your grenade stat, it gets boosted by that, and it actually does a fair amount of damage. So I will experiment with maybe like Forerunner as a swap DPS option in the swap tab at some point, which might be potentially interesting. But besides that, Forerunner has really nothing going for it for endgame content. So I'm going to go ahead and place it into the E tier, fairly obvious there. And we're going to go ahead and move on to Gjallarhorn. Gjallarhorn's an interesting one. So Gjallarhorn is a former entrant into the S tier. So where is it now? Where does Galley go now? That's a good question. So Galley, number one, enables probably the most potent fireteam weapon ad clear strategy in the game, which is of course bipod pack rockets. There's nothing in this game that is capable of lethally killing enemies, at least weapon-wise, faster than a fireteam of guardians wielding bipod rockets with Pack Hunter, especially with Argent Ordnance and, perpetual destruction, all this sort of stuff. So is that overkill? Do people really use that anymore? Do people not rely on abilities more often these days? If we had an encounter where you're using weapons to kill enemies and the goal is just to nuke enemies as quickly as possible, I think Galley with bipod rockets is still the best method. However, the situation doesn't really tend to come up these days. It's not really like a real scenario, so I'm not going to give it too many points for that. But Galley does also enable one of the strongest fireteam DPS options in the game as well, in the form of Cluster and Aggregate Hezen, with Shoot Salute or like Turncoat, or with something like Envious or even Overflow or Auto-Looting. So yeah, Galley, it's an enabler of, two of the 90th percentile strats in the game, I would say. So I'm going to go ahead and give Galley an A tier placement. It's good threefold, right? It's pretty good at, assisting your teammates with ad clear by giving them Pack Hunter in both DPS and roam. So that's two separate use cases. And then it itself, even if you're not buffing any teammates, it is really, really good for ad clear, right? There's nothing quite like just dumping Galley into a room of enemies. If you want to kill like a large group of enemies in a room and you want to be doing it without any sort of crazy setup, just dumping a Galley shot in there, pretty surefire solution, right? So Galley is pretty good for that as well. And so I feel like its A tier placement is fairly reasonable. Next up, we have Grand Overture. So Grand Overture had its time in the sun. Vespers day one, everybody was pre-stacking on those buttons. It was used for burst damage strategies on like Caretaker at some point in speedrunning. It was used for a couple other bosses as well. Grand Overture has seen some success in the past. Unfortunately, Grand Overture these days, extremely outdated damage profile. Total damage, not even really that impressive. And the ad clear is absolutely terrible. And so Grand Overture, unfortunately, I'm going to give it an E tier. It definitely has an exotic feel. It's definitely not like your standard machine gun. And the burst that it provides from those missiles loaded, even though completely outdated in its function, certainly provides something over like a legendary machine gun. So E tier is deserved, but certainly doesn't really have any role anymore in endgame content. Next up, we have Graviton Lance. Graviton Lance is, as we all know, I'm pretty sure at this point, a pretty good Void primary. It has one of the most crazy chainable splash effects, up there with like Necro splash effects. It's really good, right? It's really good. The only problem Graviton Lance, I suppose, has is getting that first kill can be like a little bit slow compared to some other weapons because it doesn't have any sort of self-contained damage buff. And of course, it has no artifact support for its specific weapon type in the form of a pulse rifle, even though it is a void weapon, so it gets a lot of void buffs. So yeah, Graviton Lance, I'm going to go ahead and place it into the D tier. It's similar in power to me compared to like a Collective Obligation. It's a bit more explosive, but Collective Obligation is better in lower power content where you're maybe not getting as many kills and your chaining is not happening as often. Okay, next up we have another Graviton weapon, which is Graviton Spike. Graviton Spike is an on-hit weapon. A lot of exotic primaries are on-kill, very kill-hungry weapons, and so they tend to fall off in lower power content. Graviton Spike is not really that way. Unfortunately, its on-hit effects are not that powerful, right? The arc overcharge, right? The lightning strikes, the stasis overcharge with the crystals and all that. Like on paper, they sound pretty good, but in practice, this weapon is just not as lethal as a lot of exotic primaries that are going to feature in the D tier when you actually try to use this weapon in upper level content. And not to mention that the synergy of this weapon is a little bit weaker than a lot of the void stuff we have in the sandbox this patch. So yeah, Graviton Spike, unfortunately, I'm going to have to place it into the E tier. It's a cool weapon, certainly a cool design, but unfortunately, in my opinion, the tempo of this weapon is still a little slow for endgame standards compared to a lot of the really crazy, splashy, lethal stuff that we have in the D tier and the C tier. Okay, next up we have Hardlight. So Hardlight, this is another fundamentals weapon. The only thing special about this weapon is that it can ricochet twice, right? All the other ricochet rounds weapons in this game, they only ricochet once. This thing ricochets twice. The only time I've ever seen this thing used in endgame play at all to like some effect is in Desert Perpetual, Iatros starting that boss from the bottom with that kind of Hardlight lineup that we cooked up. That is the only time I've ever seen anyone use Hardlight in endgame content. I'm really not going to put that even in E tier. That's such a niche thing that I'm just going to put in F tier. I'm just going to put in F tier. This thing is worse than legendary autos for sure, right? It is essentially a legendary auto that has a 30% damage perk, which is like, there's legendary autos that have 30% damage perk and jolting feedback and repulsor raise and destabilize. There's no reason to really use this weapon. Even like the ricochet thing is just like, it's so niche, right? It's so niche. So I'm going to go ahead and put it into the F tier for endgame PvE. Next up, we have Hawkmoon. Hawkmoon, unfortunately, while it is a better weapon archetype than Deadman's Tale, it suffers from the same problem, which is it does good single target damage, but it's a single target kinetic primary in 2026. So you're going to be lacking in artifact synergy as well as legendary perk combos that are kind of unique, like Shoot Load Explosive Payload Attrition Orbs, etc. Or even some of like the Strand and Stasis weapons in the same slot that it's competing with that are legendaries. They're just going to be better for like splash ad clear gameplay. And so I'm going to go ahead and put Hawkmoon into the F tier. It's certainly not relevant with Lucky Pants either. And so yeah, there's nothing really to speak of here. Similar problem as Deadman's Tale, single target kinetic primary in the big 2/6. Next up, we have Heart Shadow. Heart Shadow, kind of an interesting choice here. So Heart Shadow's damage profile is pretty terrible compared to legendary swords. The only thing this thing is really useful for is for debuff extension. It's a debuff extension option that applies weaken on hit. And so yeah, if you have a tracker user that wants to do sword damage, they can swap to like Heart Shadow and do some sort of extension there. But you could argue that they should just use like Withering Gaze and then use like a normal legendary like heavy sword. So Heart Shadow, it definitely has something over legendary swords. Like it has a niche, I suppose, that I could see it being used for one day in endgame content in some really crazy contrived scenario. So I'm not going to put it in the F tier, but it certainly doesn't escape the E tier. Next up, unfortunately, we have another low placement, and that's going to be Heir Apparent. Heir Apparent, this thing is literally just worse than a legendary LMG. It has ramping time, it has no real damage perks, and the arc shield melts like butter when it comes to endgame content. And so I'm going to go ahead and place Heir Apparent into the F tier. Doesn't really need to be explained. It's just worse than a legendary LMG. Next up, we have Heirloom. So Heirloom is kind of interesting. Heirloom has been buffed quite a bit since it's released because, you know, it did release pretty weak. Heirloom, I'm going to go ahead and just tell you right now, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the C tier. There's two main reasons to use Heirloom. Number one is it is a weapon that applies high Scorch in a single shot, and weapon source Scorch actually counts as weapon damage for Envious Arsenal. So if you want to use this thing for crossbow DPS, you know, with like an Envious, a good shout, you can. Some people also use it as a raw swap option, but I don't think it's as good for that as people think it is, even though it is buffed by Mobius Quiver. On top of that, it also has surprisingly good splash burst damage. So Tessellation is used often in speedrunning for just killing like a group of ads instantly as they spawn in the special weapon slot. Heirloom is kind of capable of doing the same thing on a small delay, and it's a little bit less consistent, but it's a lot more ammo efficient and doesn't require a grenade, obviously, right? So this thing has a lot of good total damage for red bar ad clear, you know, over like a long span of time. The only problem is the tempo of this weapon is a bit slower than other special ad clear weapons because you do have to be ADSing for a long period of time. So you do have to kind of preempt where you're going to be shooting this thing and kind of spawn camping ads with it. And even then, it's a little less lethal than some of the other options that we have in the sandbox. And I'd much rather use something like a Dead Messenger over an Heirloom for roam content, but it does have some uncommon use cases. And so I would put it in my head in like the lower side of C tier. All right, next up, we have everyone's kind of crown jewel these days, which is, of course, Hierarchy of Needs. Hierarchy of Needs. So there's a couple uses for this thing. Let's talk about its original use case, which was roam content, right? People used to use this thing with like Ember of Combustion or like Tether, and they would just kind of sit in a corner of a GM and just like spam these Seekers over and over, which would generate a lot of super. Obviously, super gen has been nerfed, so maybe that's not as viable of a strat these days, but Hierarchy of Needs, in my opinion, for roam content, not that great, right? It's a little immobile. You have to like set up this ring and then like sit behind it. And a lot of other exotic primaries would already be done clearing the room by the time you have like the ring set up and you're already like shooting things as a turret, and you have to move around, right? So yeah, Hierarchy of Needs, not amazing for roam content. Now let's talk about what it does for damage. Hierarchy of Needs for damage is like the galley for bow DPS, which crossbows are obviously very strong, but obviously it by itself, I'm sure a lot of people have discovered recently that it by itself is also very, very good for Mobius Quiver DPS. And so this thing with like the Seekers inheriting weapon buffs as well, if I'm not mistaken. So the Scorch and the Ignitions that they create can be buffed as well. Yeah, very, very strong option. The Hierarchy buff to like Scorch with the Seekers was definitely like a good change for the weapon. But is this thing, you know, like, is it universally meta warping? I don't think so. It's kind of like a galley in that respect, right? You can use it for roam. I would say galley is a better assistant when it comes to roam content, but it does enable the strongest fireteam DPS strat in the game. If we go ahead and look at the boss damage spreadsheet, let me scroll all the way up. What's sitting at the top? That's right. Envious Arsenal, High Ground, Accelerated Assault, Heavy Bolts. I just realized Accelerated Assault is listed twice here. Let me just fix that real quick. But yeah, Heavy Bolts, Envious, High Ground, Accelerated Assault, a good shout, with 3 Guidance Rings. Notice the difference here between 3 Guidance Rings and no Guidance Rings, right? So it does enable the strongest fireteam DPS strat in the game. And so I do have to give it some props for that. But I will say it's certainly worse than Galley, for example, or Dead Messenger or Quiet when it comes to the ad clear front. So I'm not going to give it S tier. You'll find that with some of the other A tier placements, if you're the best at one specific thing, but you're not that great at some other facets of endgame content, we're going to put you into the A tier. Next up, we have Icebreaker. Now, Icebreaker is a little interesting. It's always been kind of a sweetheart when it comes to like speedrunners, solo players, challenge players. I think other players kind of underrate it outside of the kind of Stasis Titan thing where you can use it like Fighting Lion and you can shoot targets that you've frozen, get a nice little explosion, and of course you get your ammo back. So Icebreaker is kind of nice for Roam for that specific kind of build. If you're crazy on the aim and you're hitting like mid-air Howl of the Storm flick shots with your Icebreaker. But Icebreaker, yeah, situationally useful for that. But the main thing Icebreaker is actually good for is, obviously, it has a higher single-shot burst damage than like a typical legendary sniper because of its compensated low fire rate. But on top of that, it is good at making ammo. You can kill stuff with other weapons and abilities and just basically get free ammo in your energy slot out of thin air. And of course, Icebreaker's conversion to other special types, like you kill one orange bar with like a different weapon, you get potentially 20 to 30% of your ammo back. That being said, right now in a sandbox where ammo is really not a problem, right? We have so many ammo options in this game, so many ammo generation options in this game now that like Icebreaker is really not necessary. And in a lot of content where you are caring about your ammo, you're using like an exotic heavy or using like a different exotic. And so Icebreaker kind of struggles to find use. However, I will say this minimal role that it provides, as well as its ability to have some sort of use when it comes to damage/roam, I will give it a D tier for that, but it is certainly a more minimized role than a lot of the stuff in the C tier for sure. Okay, next up we have a fan favorite, which is of course Izanagi's Burden. Izanagi's Burden, highest damage burst special in the game besides Still Hunt Nighthawk. Maybe there's some other stuff as well, but in a single, long range hit scan shot, it is kind of hard to beat Izzy outside of Still Hunt, like I mentioned. So Izzy was one where I kind of struggled because I thought it was like maybe top of C tier or low B tier. Obviously has a crazy legacy in speedrunning and even for damage as well. For a swap option, it's pretty good right now. Excellent swap DPS if you don't rehone. If you do rehone, still pretty decent swap DPS, like worth swapping off over A499 to like shoot a kinetic rupture or something like that. Also has, decent sustained damage, right? If we go ahead and look at Izanagi's Burden, obviously the total damage is going to be like pathetic, but if we look at Izanagi's Burden here, includes rehone time, hone before rally, sniper's meditation, assume stack, 6.6k. That's pretty good. That's pretty good for a special, right? That's going to be higher than stuff like A499. And A499, this is assuming you're dumping as well, right? So yeah, Izanagi's Burden, certainly not bad for damage, right? Can be used for damage. And, even in speedrunning, it's still used for like one-shotting enemies across the map. There's nothing quite like just, nuking something with Izzy across the map. Doesn't require any sort of setup, like Still Hunt, no rallying, no orbs, no crits, whatever, no Nighthawk. It just, just hone it and go. And so it's still used for, famously breaking like Tormentor shoulders and SE and stuff like that. So I gave Izzy like a B tier. It's certainly like on the lower end of B tier in my head compared to some of the C tier stuff. Like it's certainly closer in viability to those weapons, but it's a bit on the borderline. It's a bit on the borderline. If you wanted to argue that it should be C tier, like I wouldn't necessarily blame you. Okay, next up we have Jotun. Jotun is just bad. Yeah, Jotun is just not good. This thing is literally just worse than a legendary fusion when it comes to DPS. It's worse than some legendary fusions when it comes to ad clear. It's unwieldy. It's just, I don't know. It's a funny PvP exotic, but I'm gonna place it into the F tier. It is just worse than legendary fusions. Okay, next up we have Kvostov. So Kvostov is a bit of an interesting choice. A lot of people love this thing in solos and challenges with like Radiant Dance Machines. While this thing is not as lethal as some of the other D tier exotic primaries that we're going to be mentioning, it is very helpful for hitting a bunch of enemies, especially now that it has Attrition Orbs as its catalyst. It has Shoot to Loot as well, which is kind of useful. But this thing's main role in endgame content is that if during damage you're going to be running like a shoot to loot explosive payload hand cannon anyway, it's one of the best on-hit consistent kind of auto rifles to use in the kinetic slot if you're just going to use an exotic during roam content. And so it's like a good comfort pick for like solo and challenge players. It obviously has no utility in speedrunning, and maybe during like a day one, if you're using like an exotic heavy, you would never use Kvostov. So similar situation as Choir. And so I'm going to go ahead and place it into the D tier. It has a pretty minimal role, I would say, in a lot of endgame content, and has some pretty specific requirements to kind of shape the niche that it fills, especially now that contest content is not a thing anymore, where I think the Passion team was like a big fan of like using a bunch of Kvostovs to get like assist ammo credit on a bunch of people for ammo purposes. But these days, the sandbox, I feel like even if we had like a future day one, the sandbox wouldn't really like necessitate using Kvostov for that purpose either. So I don't know, Kvostov is neither here nor there. It's obviously a very good kinetic exotic primary, but it is still a primary and still requires some loadout restrictions to like get it going in your build. It does have good artifact synergy though. Like of all the kinetic primaries, it does have some of the best artifact synergy, being an auto rifle and having attrition orbs. So yeah, that's it for Kvostov. I'm going to go ahead and move on to Le Monarch next. Le Monarch, also a former fan favorite as well from like episode Heresy. Everybody was using this thing with like bolt charge barricades. I still see some people doing this and, using Le Monarch with Stormskeep Barricade Titan with flashover. Certainly a lot weaker than it was that season with the flashover nerf. But yeah, Le Monarch, I would say it's certainly exotic in its effect, but has basically no real use case in endgame content if you're playing optimally. And so I'm going to go ahead and place it into the E tier. It's certainly better than regular bows for some things, right? The fact that its poison ticks count as like bow damage, and so they can activate like mag percentage based effects and set bonuses when it comes to like Storm's Keep, bolt charge and stuff like that. It's certainly a unique interaction that, could see some use somewhere. But for now, there's like no real endgame use case for Le Monarch in the current sandbox. Okay, next up we have Legend of Acreus. Legend of Acreus is a bit of a classic, of course, in D2 heavy DPS history. This thing is essentially just like a heavy pellet shotgun with trench barrel, and it does a lot of damage, right? It does a lot of damage. So let's go ahead and see where it stands before I recommend it to you. So Legend of Acreus, 5.5k. 5.5k, let's go ahead and look at Found Verdict. Found Verdict over here, aggregate charge trench barrel, 4.7k. So pretty good Found Verdict, right? But Acreus is definitely going to be a step up. And Acreus, if you look at a boss like Herald, a lot of people opted for Acreus over Wolfsbane on a boss like Herald. Wolfsbane is certainly like the slams and all that. If a boss is finicky and moving around, it's certainly a less consistent option than Acreus. And you're not even giving up that much, DPS if you're using Acreus over Wolfsbane. The only major difference is, of course, going to be the total damage, right? So Acreus, I would say, is fairly decent, right? It's a consistent option. Would you use it if you're playing optimal endgame content? A lot of the time, no. But it is just so consistent and such like a decent power level weapon that I couldn't resist giving it C tier. And so I'm going to go ahead and place it into the C tier. Endgame content, a lot of the time it's about consistency. And, if you want a consistent melee damage option, Acreus is pretty good. It's competing with some of like the high tier swords. So I think it being in the C tier is kind of fair. You could argue it's like high D tier, but I think C tier is fine. Next up, we have Leviathan's Breath, which is right underneath. Leviathan's Breath, let's go ahead and see where that ranks in the sustain tab. And this is a little bit simulated because it assumes that you instantly have a full bar of Levy Breath. Then of course you have like full reload buffs and you're shooting very quickly. But yeah, Levy Breath is, it's pretty good. It's pretty good, right? 13k sustained DPS. In practice, a bit lower than that. But yeah, it's like very easy, simple option to use. If you don't have multiple hierarchy users in the team, this is going to go down. And obviously this is simulated to assume that you're the one getting all the ignitions. Levy Breath has no such kind of requirement. And so Levy Breath, if you're like solo, or if you are in a fire team without any sort of hierarchy users to like stack with, it is going to be a better damage option. And so because of how easy it is, how simple it is to use with like Mobius Quiver, I'm going to go ahead and put Levy actually into the A tier. Right now, if you're willing to swap class at least and run like Void Hunter, it is easily the most consistent high damage option. Like it's the easiest to use consistent high damage option. Like if you want to argue like 1k is like super easy to use, and Levy I would say is also pretty easy to use as long as you're willing to play Void Hunter. And so yeah, Levy, I'm going to go ahead and put it in the A tier just because of how easy to use. Like if we were to make a graph of like ease of use versus like raw damage output, Levy is definitely like in the top right corner, which for endgame content, a lot of people value that. So I'm going to go ahead and put that into the A tier. Okay, next up on our list, we have Lodestar. So Lodestar, unfortunately, despite the fact that it has like a unique niche as being like a primary trace, traces don't have any issues with ammo economy, so it being a primary is not even like a real advantage. And in fact, the actual damage profile of this thing is worse than a legendary trace, even with like a mediocre damage perk with harsh refraction. This thing also doesn't really have 100% uptime on harsh refraction compared to like a void trace with like destabilizing rounds. And so I'm honestly going to give this thing an F tier. I think it is just worse than legendaries. I don't think there's ever a reason why you would ever use Lodestar over another like arc primary, let alone an arc trace, or even a void trace or a strand trace, or like a bunch of other traces, a bunch of other primaries. So yeah, Lodestar, I'm going to say is F tier, worse than legendaries. Let's go ahead and move on to Lord of Wolves next. Lord of Wolves obviously did experience a bit of a fall off after it was nerfed. Let's go ahead and look at Lord of Wolves on the spreadsheet here, sitting at 4.2k DPS. This thing, if you remember, Duality, I believe, has around like 80k total damage, 74k total damage, but does have higher DPS. And Duality, I would argue, has an easier precision requirement than Lord of Wolves. Lord of Wolves requires you to hit 100% of those crits to get 100% of your damage, whereas Duality is like, you obviously need to hit all of your crits as well, but it's a lot easier. You have a lot of, a lot more time to like space out your shots. So Duality, easier to use, similar damage profile, higher DPS. And so Lord of Wolves, I'm going to have to put it into the E tier. Bit of a fall off from this guy, but not the worst. I'm not going to put it in the F tier. Okay, next up we have Lorentz Driver. Lorentz Driver, it has a little bit of like a marking gimmick. You pick up these telemetry patterns, you get the ammo back. This thing's ammo economy is in theory like very, very good, right? It has like basically infinite ammo. If you're willing to go on this little like, bounty hunter mechanic, the ammo economy is very good. But when it comes to endgame content, even with like particle assist in this thing, yeah, it's just such slow tempo. It's so slow the way that this thing plays out in endgame content that, it doesn't really have any real use in endgame content. Like once you get the 3 patterns and you have like Lagrangian sights, it's not terrible, right? Like you can chain kills fairly easily, but getting that perk up in endgame content, especially in fireteam content when you have, teammates with you, getting kills, this thing is just really gimmicky. It's really, really gimmicky. But the gimmick is, it's cool. I suppose it's exotic in feel, and certainly not something that other legendary like linears or like fusions have access to. So I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier, and we're going to move on to Lumina. Lumina, how the mighty have fallen. Well, you were never that mighty, but 35% damage buff. That's what it was used for before. These days, there's basically no real reason to use Lumina. In speedrunning, Lumina's niche has largely been taken over by Rocket Grappling and Alethonym Grappling. When it comes to low mans or like dungeons, buffing your teammates with Lumina, even if you don't have a Warlock, the exotic weapons that we have are so strong that you would rather use like 3 Still Hunts over like 1 Lumina and 2 Still Hunts a majority of the time. And then when it comes to buffing your teammates in regular Fireteam content, everyone just uses Boots of the Assembler. So there's no real reason to use this weapon. I mean, I suppose Lumina grappling, I can see like the slow diagonal grapple being used for something maybe. And like maybe there's some scenario where like you're using very legendary focused heavy damage. And so maybe you run a Lumina instead of running Boots of the Assembler if you don't have a Warlock for whatever reason. So I would say it's better than a legendary in that respect. I could see it having some use at some point, but right now at least, there is basically no room for Lumina in endgame content if you are trying to make your loadout as optimal as possible. Okay, right below that, we have kind of the opposite of Lumina. We have Malfeasance. Malfeasance, unfortunately, I mean, this thing had a little bit of shine, a little bit of a spotlight during that 1 week of corrupted farming where everybody was using it with Lucky Pants because it does more damage to Taken. Unfortunately, you know, since then, it's only been downhill for Malfeasance. Lucky Pants nerf. Malfeasance itself has been kind of replaced by a bunch of other kinetic hand cannons when it comes to splash ad clear. And so, yeah, I'm going to unfortunately have to put Malfeasance in the F tier. Even the exotic effect of Malfeasance is essentially just like an on-hit stacking damage perk-ish, sort of. And other kinetic hand cannons just have that, but don't require you to land 5 slugs, have stronger splash damage perks, and have utility perks as well. So Malfeasance, I would argue, is worse than a legendary kinetic hand cannon for ad clear. Certainly worse than like Strand and like Stasis hand cannon. Some of the best ones that we've gotten recently are certainly a lot more useful than Malfeasance. Okay, the next weapons ranking might surprise you a little bit, and that is, of course, Merciless. Merciless in a season with Particle and some other assisting factors, I'm actually going to go ahead and put it into the B tier. This thing is actually quite good for low health bosses if you need to be on a sword for mechanics or something like that, and then for final stands, it's obviously excellent, and then for solo, it's pretty good as well, and then it's also really good at, in super underlevel content, being able to nuke down mini bosses just because of Particle being a thing. And so, yeah, Merciless, being able to apply Particle really quickly and take great advantage of it as well. It's obviously not a very ammo efficient weapon, but in the current sandbox, you know, it's not really that big of a problem. Plenty of people were using like Merciless in like 5 feet Pantheon, for example, and finding a lot of great success with it. So I would say that's enough to say it has a notable niche in endgame content right now, even if it is carried by the artifact a little bit. It's certainly pretty good and maybe a little bit underrated for roam content by some players. Next up, we have Microcosm. Microcosm, unfortunately, well, it has 3 niches and it's kind of been replaced in all of them. The first one is being like a Thunderlord, right? And it's just worse than there's like 20 easy legendary heavy options that I would rather take over Microcosm, so it's completely replaced in that respect. The second thing is you can use it to get super, I suppose, right? It gives you extra super energy, has Thresh. Unfortunately, we're in a sandbox with like enhanced dealer's choice, with like an elemental supercharger. There's no reason to use Microcosm for that. It's an exotic heavy, right? It's like one of the most restrictive things you can do to your loadout. No real reason to use Microcosm for that. The final thing Microcosm is potentially good for is for dealing damage to combatant shields, right? Like Arbalest. However, Microcosm is a heavy weapon. So it's a heavy weapon. You have to be willing to sacrifice your exotic and your heavy slot to make this work. Whereas Arbalest, it's a kinetic slot exotic, right? So you can run like a rocket or something like that on top of Arbalest. So it is a lot more restrictive. However, obviously compared to Arbalest, you can, you know, fire it for a longer period of time. It has much more like total bullets to deal with these shields. I mean, you're dealing with something like a boss tier subjugator, like the ones that you find in like Dual Destiny. Microcosm has like a niche against those, but you know, we're at the end of service now and there's no like boss tier subjugators in sight besides basically those, the Dual Destiny ones. There's maybe like 1 or 2 others that are in missions and stuff like that. But besides that, you know, the ones in SE, for example, the left and right ones, those are not bosses. I think that's a common myth. Those are not boss subjugators. So Microcosm does not do any additional damage to those as far as I'm aware. And so yeah, Microcosm's niche is essentially just limited to if you want a heavy damage option for like the shield stuff, for like maybe low man Callous Final Stand or something like that. But even then, you could just use Arbalest. So yeah, I don't know. Microcosm, gonna go ahead and place it into the E tier. Even less viable than Arbalest, especially because it's a heavy. Okay, coming up next in our alphabetical list, we have Mina Multitool, which I don't think anybody is going to be surprised by its placement in the F tier. It technically has some use for boosting movement speed with the Heart and Queenswalk if you want to do Trio Queenswalk. But for the most part, like this thing has literally no use in endgame content, and it's certainly a lot worse. The whole like software update 4-stage like counter progression bar thing takes 9 million years to stack in endgame content, and even after you've stacked it, you've essentially just given a scout rifle like explosive payload and like a small damage perk, which is terrible compared to what even just the most basic kinetic slot legendary scouts can do these days. case. So yeah, Might Multi-Tool definitely worse than legendaries, even though it has like that tiny use case for boosting movement speed. There's a lot of other stuff that boosts movement speed in this game, so you don't even necessarily need to use Mida for that, but it is an option, I suppose. Next up, we have Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo does, unlike Might Multi-Tool, have like a small niche in endgame content for like the melee stuff, like the bayonet obviously gets boosted by some melee damage benefits. However, this thing it's a tempo problem. It's always a tempo problem with these things. It's just way too slow. It's a single target kinetic auto rifle, and even if I was on a melee build, I would honestly probably rather use Kvostov over Monte Carlo, even though Monte Carlo has like the random chance of giving me my melee ability back. And so Monte Carlo, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. The exotic effect is certainly unique and the bayonet's kind of cool, but there's no real use case for this thing in endgame content in optimized play. Okay, next up we have Necrochasm. Necrochasm I think is a little bit underrated. Obviously getting a crit kill in harder content where enemies are like a bit beefier with an auto rifle that has a bit of recoil and it's like a rapid fire auto rifle can be a little bit difficult, I suppose. But once you get that crit kill, the damage of the spread of corruption is so high on this thing compared to some other primary splash effects, dealing up to 630 arc damage, right? That's a lot if you compare this to some of the other splash effects that we've seen on this page so far. And so that outlier alone is able to make this thing get a lot of chained kills, even in really, really low power content. That being said, there are other options that are a little bit more consistent, don't require crit kills to start their chaining process. And so I'm going to go ahead and put Necrochasm into the D tier. I think it's a fairly competent ad clicker option, even though maybe it's a little bit more situational than something like a Kvostov. But you could argue that, they're both good at their own individual things. Necrochasm is good for like, nuclear bomb off of one kill, whereas Kvostov is more of a consistent on-hit option for just getting kills over time, one by one, if you're using something like Radiant Dance Machines. So next up, we have New Land Beyond. Now, New Land Beyond, okay, I think this is supposed to be able to New Malpai. So Compendium Guy, if you're seeing this, some of these are not alphabetically ordered correctly. But yeah, New Land Beyond, when this thing came out, the whole idea was it's a special, unique frame, bolt action sniper rifle, has a crazy amount of total damage, really, really good for roam. Now, if we go ahead and look at the Helmsman right over here, right? This thing has 4.4k DPS, 231k total. Let's look at where New Land Beyond lands. Right, New Land Beyond, right underneath that. I mean, technically it's infinite because of kinetic synthesis, but 231k total for a special is effectively infinite. So they're basically around the same DPS, except for the Helmsman is the exact same thing. And this is with accounting for manual reloads from the Helmsman, by the way. Right, so if the Helmsman had the same thing as New Land Beyond Catalyst, where it didn't have to reload, it would have higher DPS. So this thing has higher DPS than New Land Beyond because it has access to DARCI perk from network targeting. And even if you didn't have access to DARCI perk, this thing wouldn't really be that much below New Land Beyond. So New Land Beyond is largely overshadowed by a legendary when it comes to its like roam crit shooting role being like very ammo efficient. And it's a very high quality of life weapon, and with kinetic synthesis, I'm sure like you'll get a lot of value out of it. But it's just like there's no real reason to use New Land Beyond. In the modern ammo economy, its whole thing of just being like a very ammo efficient weapon is not that useful. And the fact that you need to stack it before damage, for DPS is just really not competitive. 4.3k is not competitive for a special, especially given the state of legendary snipers like Conspiracy Honed in the modern meta. And so yeah, New Land Beyond, not super impressed with it. I mean, I suppose if you want a kinetic slot like Helmsman, it's good, right? I mean, I can see it being used in endgame content. It has some minimal role maybe for, shooting crits and stuff like that. So I'll put it in the D tier, kind of because of legacy. You could argue that maybe it should be like high E tier instead. But I'll give it some respect. I'll put it in like the bottom of D tier. If I was ordering within tiers, it would be like at the bottom of D tier. Yeah, you could definitely argue that this thing should just be like high E and like, Conspiracy Hone does this thing's job better and it has more quality of life. But yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence on this one, so I'll just leave it at the bottom of D tier. Next up, we have another weapon that's fallen from grace a little bit since release, and that is New Malpais. Now, New Malpais, for damage, it's just a complete non-starter, right? The DPS of this thing is terrible. Let's actually go ahead and look at where New Malpais is. Yeah, 3k. That is terrible. That total damage value is terrible, and Super Generation has been nuked on it specifically, and also Super Generation in general has been nuked. So this thing is just never being used for boss damage ever again in its life. However, there's two use cases that I've seen New Malpais be useful for. Number one, you can use it to trap ad spawns, and it's fairly effective for that ahead of time. So it's kind of like a legendary Anarchy in some ways. And then number two is you can use it to activate a bunch of objectives at the same time that are on-hit objectives. So Inspire of the Watcher, the speedrun strategy, for example, you stick these to a bunch of the Perseus nodes, you get buff, and then you activate them all at the same time, and it instantly activates all of them. So that is actually useful. Even if it's a minimal role, that is something that it alone can do and nothing else can do. So I'm going to go ahead and give New Malpais a D tier. It would also be probably lower in the D tier, maybe middle of the D tier. But yeah, it certainly has a minimal role compared to any of the stuff in the E tier. And so I do have to give it some props for that. Next up on our list is No Time to Explain. No Time to Explain is essentially like a kinetic high impact pulse rifle, which is already a terrible start. And then the on-hit damage effect that it has is like really mediocre, has no sort of artifact or subclass synergy, and I would just rather use like a regular kinetic pulse. So that's easy shoe-in for the F tier. Let's go ahead and move on to another popular pick that people have been looking at recently, and that is 1000 Voices with its brand new catalyst, the Taken Seeker catalyst. So you might be wondering, where does 1k sit? We've talked about a lot of DPS values. Maybe saying like, okay, 5k, 6k, what are we talking here for a heavy weapon? Let's go ahead and take a look. So 1000 Voices, where does it sit? 1000 Voices. So with Dawn Chorus, and assuming you get every ignition, this thing sits at 6.6k DPS, which is pretty good. That's pretty good, honestly, for a solo DPS option where like maybe you're on Well, you're on Dawn Chorus, you have Ember of Ashes, you're by yourself, you have the Catalyst, Particle Reconstruction, never have to reload, just dump. This thing is super, super easy. A lot of solos actually use 1k because 1k is good enough when it comes to total damage, when it comes to DPS, and it's super, super easy to use, right? There's no thinking, no reloading, no setup, nothing. You just shoot the boss, right? And so, yeah, I'll give 1k some credit for that. And then, however, in fire team scenarios, the second you don't have Dawn Chorus, you drop to 5.3k, which again, if we're talking about specials, right, that's kind of bordering on where some of the good specials are going to be landing here. And then what if you don't have Ember of Ashes on, so you're not getting an ignition every single shot? You drop even further to 4.8k. Now, what if you're in a fire team and you're not getting every ignition? The ignition is a fairly significant portion of 1k. You're going to be dropping down another 15%, another 20%, depending on how many people are using this gun. So I think this gun, in summary, is excellent for solo. It's excellent for solo. Melito, for example, recommends it for solo Explicator. And if there's one person to trust on solo Explicator, I think that's the guy, right? So for some of the less damage intensive solos, 1k is pretty chill. Even some of the harder like solos, I'm pretty sure Solo Witness has been done with 1k as well. So it's pretty good. It's pretty good if you're solo, especially with Dawn Chorus. However, if you're not solo and if you're in a fire team, are there, slightly higher setup but significantly higher damage heavies? Yes. Are there even better damage specials? Yes. Can you use other options? Yes. However, can you use 1k and clear solo content? The answer is also yes. I see a lot of people saying, oh, 1k is bad in fire teams. It's 1k. 1k is bad if you stack it with multiple people. It's still usable. It's still usable in fire team content. If you're just doing like a normal raid and you have 5 people on 1k, there is nothing wrong with that. It's still going to do very good damage. Okay. So I just want to clear that up. However, if you are playing optimally, yes, you would never use 1k in a fire team environment. Okay. So as a result, just because of its consistency, like I said, I'm an optimized guy, right? I do love optimizing DPS as much as the next guy. However, a lot of endgame content is consistency focused. And so to give it some props for that consistency purpose, especially for solo low main content, I'm going to go ahead and give it a B tier. It's literally good enough, right? The B tier description is it's good enough and it's very, very consistent. So that's going to be in the B tier. Okay, next up, to jump a little bit lower in the tier list again, is Osteostriga. So this thing has been nerfed significantly, and then it got rebuffed. Part of its nerf was reverted, I suppose. And so the Corruption Burst on kill, the cooldown was reduced to 2 seconds. So it doesn't chain as quickly as it did on release, but it's not as bad as it was for the period where the cooldown was significantly longer. Now, I will say Osteostriga, unfortunately, if you look at the artifact, it really doesn't synergize very well with the artifact, right? There's no SMG mods, there's some kinetic stuff mods, but really not that much. And then this weapon itself, tempo-wise, it's not that fast of like a splash spreader compared to some of the other weapons that we have. And then its raw, like minor DPS on just triggering that poison burst and low power content is really not that strong compared to the other stuff that we have. Even some of the other stuff in the E tier, to be honest with you. So Osteostriga, I do think it is certainly better than like a legendary kinetic SMG for like just splash spreading, I suppose, but it's not as good as it used to be. And even if it was as good as it used to be, I don't think it would really contend that strongly with some of the strongest stuff that we have in the D tier when it comes to exotic primaries. Okay, next up we have Outbreak Perfected. Now this one might surprise people because I know people like Outbreak a lot, but if you're familiar with endgame content at all, Outbreak is E tier. It's just E tier, right? Like it's even bordering on F tier because Super Gen, completely irrelevant. Damage is terrible. We looked at it earlier, but if you really want a reminder, I'll show you. Where is Outbreak Perfected? Jarvis, show me Outbreak Perfected. If you start at max nanites, if you start at maximum nanites, which is not realistic because even in fire teams, you have to stack the nanites. But let's say your boss damage phase starts and he already somehow has max nanites on him. The DPS of this weapon is 2.2k. That is horrible. That is the same DPS as just shooting a boss in the head with Choir repeatedly and manually reloading Choir. That is terrible. Okay? So Outbreak is just a non-starter for boss DPS. And then when it comes to ad clear as well, this thing's tempo is terrible. It's terrible. Its on-hit stacking effect on like a champion or whatever is the most plinker thing ever. And then if you're killing enemies, the disease vector nanites, they do like an okay amount of damage. But compared to some of the stuff that we have in the D tier or even in the E tier, some of the other splash effects that we have in the D tier, like we just talked about Osteostriga, this thing is way less potent than those weapons on top of receiving little to no artifact support as well. And so Outbreak just kind of has to be E tier. You could even argue that it's F tier, to be honest with you, but I'll leave it in the E tier. It's a bit of legacy respect, I suppose. I would leave it in the E tier, but
as it stands right now, this thing is just a non-starter for endgame content. Okay, next up we have Parasite. Parasite is a bit of an interesting one because it might move in placement over time as I explore more and more damage options. But Parasite has always been defined by 2 use cases, right? Number 1 is burst damage against maybe like a group of enemies or like a single target, right? So maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a mini boss, maybe it's a champion, whatever it is. You want to do a lot of burst, a lot of big splash to a single target. Now there's a lot of stuff that does similar damage to Parasite, but is a special and does burst damage, doesn't require as much setup, isn't an exotic, etc. And so Parasite is a little fallen by the wayside for stuff like that, right? You can still use it on stuff like Atrax, obviously it's good for that, but it's kind of limited in that use case. And the second thing is for swap DPS. Obviously the holster interaction got patched, but Envious Arsenal I'd say is a worthy trade. And although we've moved away from like special DPS, you could in theory use Parasite with like Conspiracy or with like threat level or some sort of other special damage option. That's certainly something you can do with Parasite, and I think it would fare pretty well. I have to do some testing with like Parasite Sanguine threat level. I think that's going to be a pretty good Warlock damage option. But besides that, yeah, Parasite, it's certainly pretty decent, right? It's certainly pretty decent. It might maybe move up to A tier based on my damage testing, but I don't think it's going to move out of B tier realistically speaking, knowing how I tend to place things. So I think Parasite being in the B tier, it's good enough. Boosting your other weapon damage by 15% is certainly not anything to scoff at. That's like an exotic level boost from a weapon that's, perfectly competent when it comes to swap DPS as well. So Parasite, I would say B tier is fair. I think A tier would be a bit of a stretch for it, even if it does end up being good for damage on like Warlock or something like that. I doubt I would move it up into the A tier, but certainly I would say it's maybe like a potentially higher B tier weapon. Okay, next we have Polaris Lance. Polaris Lance, this one is, a lot of people have loved Polaris Lance for like plinking away. I will say just, as a plinking sort of high impact scout rifle weapon, even though there is like fulmination in this artifact, we have, Torch, we have stuff like Radiant Shrapnel, there's some solar like crit stuff that is in the artifact that can support Polaris Lance. This thing is simply still too slow in its gameplay loop for endgame viability. And so yeah, I kind of do have to just give it E tier. It's certainly more exotic feeling than like, maybe like a legendary solar scout, and certainly for plinking it would, outperform a legendary scout, but there's no real use for this thing in endgame content, which is, you'll notice a lot of exotics are going to be in the E tier, and that is the exact reason why. Basically the exact line of thinking that I just described for Polaris Lance. Okay, next up we have a fan favorite, which is of course the lightsaber Praxic Blade. Praxic Blade, the main thing this is used for, okay, there's 2 things this is used for. Number 1, it's used in speedrunning for like hyperblade movement in some cases, right? So a little niche there. Number 2 though, it's a very, very consistent roam option, right? It has a lot of artifact support in like 2 or 3 different artifacts, and it's like super, super, super consistent, right? Like it's very hard to die while using this thing. It has anti-barrier, so even if it's like a sword, you can still pierce through like shields. A big problem with a lot of swords for roam is that like when you start swording like a phalanx or something, you just get pinched and thrown into a wall and die. Praxic doesn't really have as big of an issue with that because it's like intrinsic anti-barrier, and it has always been intrinsic anti-barrier, and it deals like more damage to shields as well. So yeah, pretty cool in that respect. However, Praxic Blade, if you're trying to play optimally, it's certainly not going to be up there with something like Acquire or something like a Dead Messenger or a Galley or a Hierarchy. Like it doesn't really have any like insane outlier use cases that make it like the absolute best in slot for a specific thing. It's kind of like you should kind of just throw it on and it's just gonna perform, right? You're gonna get what you expect out of it. It's nothing too crazy. There's some weird stuff you can do with it, with like the double tick leg stuff, with throwing it with like Gyro Core and like Ember of Ashes and Dawn Chorus and whatever to like get some crazy damage out of it, but that is very, very niche and kind of simulated, and we'll definitely try to like showcase that on this channel when it comes to the damage rotation stuff, but I don't think that's going to move it into like the A tier or anything like that. So I'm going to go ahead and put Praxic Blade into the B tier. It is like the definition of like a consistency exotic. It's just good enough. It's just good enough, right? And if you're wondering why, it's not in the same tier as like Choir has range, and the Praxic Blade, its range mode is, I would say, significantly worse than just using it as like a melee weapon. So yeah, good enough, pretty solid, and just a very consistent exotic, kind of like 1K. I would say like the B tier is where you're in the 90th percentile of effectiveness. You're doing 90% of what you could be doing, and you're putting in like 20%, 30% of the effort, right? Praxic Blade 1K, perfect examples of that. Okay, next we have a rather large slew of E-tier weapons. We have Prometheus Lens. So Prometheus Lens, it is a little bit special. It's a little bit special because it has a very high ammo gen. I believe it has 100 ammo gen stat. Unfortunately, this thing is kind of like Coldheart in that it kills things super, super slowly compared to some of the other exotic traces, or even just other exotic primaries, regular primaries that we are talking about and have talked about in this video so far. And so Prometheus Lens, I've always been disappointed by how long the Scorching Field takes to scorch and actually ignite things, as well as how long the Scorching Field even takes to show in the first place. And so I'm going to go ahead and move Prometheus Lens into the E tier. It's certainly exotic in feeling, and compared to like a normal solar trace, you can argue that it has like some sort of effect. But I would say, you know, with the new discoveries with like Burning Ambition and like Acacia's Dejection having Burning Ambition plus a damage perk, I don't know why you would ever use this thing over Acacia's Dejection. I'm just gonna say like the 100 ammo gen thing is maybe gonna save it from being in the F tier, but yeah, I really don't think this thing is particularly good. Okay, next up we have Quicksilver Storm. Yeah, so Quicksilver Storm, it's been nerfed a fair amount, I suppose, but honestly, even in its pre-nerf version, I don't think it would hold a candle to like the modern great primaries that we consider, especially the more supported ones. Yeah, so I don't really have much to say about Quicksilver Storm. The Nanotech Tracer Missiles variant that it has, it's honestly not very strong. And if we're talking about tempo, right, the amount of time that it takes to load the grenades and the amount of, you know, damage that each grenade does, the payoff is not as much as you would expect, I would say. So I'm going to go ahead and put Quicksilver Storm in the E tier. We're going to go ahead and move on to the exotic right below it, which is Rat King. Rat King, the only time it's ever really been used in endgame content is just to get invisibility on kill and just heal on kill and just kind of sit there and not have to worry about enemies. Although these days, I would say players are a lot more inclined to be more offensive than defensive. And so Rat King, I could see it being used for some sort of challenge content where you want to get invisibility off of a kill, but that's super few and far in between. So I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier, and certainly not good for fire team damage, by the way, if you're wondering, in case that's something that you were curious about. Next, we have Red Death Reformed. Now, Red Death Reformed is actually a very high survivability exotic. If we were playing in like year 4 or something like that, where you can't really afford to kill enemies as quickly, and you're just kind of killing enemies one by one, I think a lot of solo GM players would have loved Red Death Reformed. It's like a really great plinker weapon because it has really great stagger, right? It has unstop, it's a high impact pulse, it has intrinsics. It also has insane survivability, right? So insane survivability, and has increasing damage as your HP goes down as well. So it has basically all you'd want as like a single target survivability weapon. The problem is, the sandbox as it exists in its current form does not value exotic primaries that do this, right? There's other survivability options that you can just get from your subclass or from your set bonus or from whatever, and you want your exotic primary, if you're going to use an exotic primary, to hit like a truck, to nuke things, or to really, really synergize well with your build. And Red Death Reformed just doesn't offer this. It just doesn't offer this. And so I'm going to have to go ahead and put Red Death Reformed in the E tier. The exotic effect is certainly like noticeable, and it's certainly something that like a legendary can't give you, but is this something that you would, you know, save a slot for in your endgame weapon loadout if you're really valuing optimal play? Definitely not. Okay, next up we have Revision Zero. Revision Zero's damage profile is actually fairly decent, but unfortunately, it's the same problem that we talked about with Hawkmoon and DMT. I would argue that Revision Zero's like crit mode is like a little bit more useful than the stuff that DMT and Hawkmoon have to afford, and so I'll put Revision Zero a little bit higher than them, but it's really not by much, right? Revision Zero is in the E tier. The kinetic shockwave thing, you know, the exhausting thing is kind of cool, I suppose. But yeah, the payoff, the slowness of this weapon, the single target nature when it's just shooting normally, not a good look, not a great look for Revision Zero. It's definitely decent, right? And, you know, I know people have very like highly praised this thing for barrier champions in my comment section before, but we're really out of that meta right now. And even in that meta, Revision Zero was like a fairly slow playstyle weapon that really doesn't hold a candle to like modern standards. And so I'm going to go ahead and put Revision Zero in the E tier, and we're going to go ahead and move on to Risk Runner. Risk Runner is interesting. Risk Runner, you can make an argument for being like low D tier. It's definitely been used in some solos before to get that arc DR, that arc shield while you're running. For example, like solo Caretaker Risk Runner is a classic. It's used in that. And I think the Catalyst has only helped it, right? Chain Reaction activating Arc Conductor on your own kills if you're near enough to the explosion. Of course, Chain Reaction just on its own is great for just the weapon itself. When you're getting chain kills, it just, you know, blows them all up. So that's obviously really helpful. Unfortunately, Risk Runner, not a lot of artifact support. Doesn't actually have any sort of synergy with arc effects, right? Obviously, its arc conductor thing is good and it's like a strong effect, but it doesn't synergize with any like 3.0 stuff. And so Risk Runner, it's basically just using endgame content for the arc conductor effect. It's really niche, and it's honestly niche enough that I would drop it into the E tier, even if I would consider it to be like a high E tier weapon. So I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. The use case is just a little bit too restrictive. Next up, moving down, we have Ruinous Effigy. Ruinous Effigy is, I think, maybe like a little bit underrated, but unfortunately, I do think this thing is a little gimmicky and just straight up worse than Wave Splitter. Wave Splitter is easily the best exotic ad clear trace that we have in the game right now that scales into endgame content. Ruinous Effigy, I mean, the orb thing is kind of cool, and the catalyst is kind of cool, and it certainly has like similar synergies with the artifact compared to something like Wave Splitter, but the damage profile is just weaker. It's just weaker. So Ruinous Effigy, I'm going to go ahead and place it into the E tier. I know there's a lot of Ruinous Effigy fans out there, and I do think it is like kind of an underrated exotic, even if you're not like LARPing and using the spheres all the time. It's not bad. It's not bad. So yeah, I'll go ahead and put it into the E tier, and we're going to move on to Salvation's Grip. Salvation's Grip. Salvation's Grip is exclusively used for DSM and speedrunning and basically nothing else. There's some content, for example, like starting Duo Harpy and stuff like that, where you need to make crystals to like stand on them in order to like start something or do a tether or something like that. So it has some use in endgame content. And so those two things combined, I think I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. It is a big enough of a minimal role, even if it's a rather small role. In endgame content, it has a defined role that cannot be replaced. And so yeah, it's the only thing that can make crystals for like blocking spawns and stuff like that. So I'll put it in the D tier, even though it's a weapon that's definitely used for like non-standard purposes. You're definitely not like shooting ads or like shooting a boss with this thing. Okay, next up we have Service of Luzaku right below that. Service of Luzaku, it's kind of funny, I suppose, like the whole like Threadling Nest, Pack Tactics, infinite damage thing that people have been doing. That's kind of funny. I suppose you could also use it to like assist with like the Grasp Hunter set Tangle infinite damage thing. But for the most part, this thing is not really useful. In endgame content, the only real niche that it might have is it's capable of creating the only interact that can currently cancel a relic pickup. So yeah, I mean, I guess if you want to make Threadling Nest to complete some sort of solo or duo challenge with this, that is an option. But for the most part, I don't think Service of Luzaku is really useful in endgame content. I think that niche is honestly a little too small to put in the same tier as something like an Arbalest or like a Buried Bloodline. And so I'm going to go ahead and put it in the E tier, even though Service of Luzaku is like, it's like a funny exotic. I've certainly seen it do some funny things. I don't think it's really deserving of being in the D tier compared to some of the other exotics that are there. Next up, we have Skyburner's Oath. Skyburner's Oath honestly surprised me a little bit with how consistent of an exotic primary it is. It is kind of like a very laid-back style of weapon, but if you're going to choose like a Plinker type weapon, I think this weapon paired with like Dawn Chorus and like builds like that, I think is actually pretty solid, because even though the playstyle is kind of slow, the chaining effects that it can have, and then the Dawn Chorus and Fulmination just chaining over and over again, can be like pretty solid. I would say this weapon probably has the highest ratio of like output to input of all the slow playstyles that you could choose from. So while I don't think it's at the same level as like a Kvostov or something like a Graviton Lance, I'm certainly willing to give it like a, in my head at least, like a high E tier. I think it's certainly better than something like a Polaris Lance. But yeah, Skyburner's Oath, after the buffs, for example, like Incandescent Burning Ambition given as the catalyst, I think it's pretty good for chaining those kinds of explosions. I just don't think in endgame optimal play, where you're really hard pressed to even take a primary to begin with, that Skyburner's Oath is ever a choice that you're going to make if you're really kind of trying to optimize your loadout. Next up, we have Slayer's Fang. Now, I know Slayer's Fang has been getting a lot of praise recently. People have been drawing comparisons to Choir. First of all, Slayer's Fang doesn't compare to Choir, because Choir has targeting autoloader, it has sustained fire, it has a lot of artifact support, on top of the fact that burst damage wise with Onslaught, Hipfire doesn't even compare to Slayer's Fang. And on top of that, Choir has much longer range than Slayer's Fang. So they just don't compete when it comes to, being roam weapons. Slayer's Fang, I've heard, with ammo economy buffs, it's capable of upkeeping ammo and you can use it as an ad clear weapon. And certainly I know it has synergy with like no backup plans and stuff like that. But are you going to choose Slayer's Fang as your ad clear weapon over a Dead Messenger, over a Choir in endgame content? And I would say if you're an optimal endgame player, the answer is never going to be yes. The answer is never going to be yes. So while Slayer's Fang is certainly like a creative and interesting alternative to like your standard ad clear options, especially with the void support that it gets from the artifact, I just think it is a shotgun. It's inherently a shotgun, so it lacks range. And then raw up close damage, Dead Messenger is going to be better, or like some other weapons might be better. And so Slayer's Fang, I just don't think there's ever a case in endgame content where for boss damage, it's certainly not best in slot. And I don't think it's the optimal pick in any sort of endgame content when it comes to roam either. So it's a cool weapon, and it obviously synergizes well with no backup plans. But for me to put Slayer's Fang into the D tier because it synergizes with like no backup plans would be the same as me putting like Fighting Lion into the D tier because it synergizes with the Howl of the Storm build, which is arguably a stronger build than like the no backup plans build to begin with. So yeah, Slayer's Fang, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. Next up, we have Sleeper Simulant. Sleeper Simulant, another fan favorite when it comes to boss DPS. Unfortunately, even with particle support, this weapon is pretty terrible. Among legendary linears, among exotic linears, among exotic easy to do damage with weapons, this thing ranks among the worst, to be honest with you. And so yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put Sleeper into the E tier. It's going to escape the F tier because technically you can clear endgame content with it and it's like an easy to use weapon, but there are like 10 other like just as easy exotic heavies to use that are just better in damage. So kind of unfair to put in the F tier. Like there's stuff that I can see where like if you're using Black Talon, you're just like not clearing, for example. Where Sleeper, like it does enough damage where like you could clear endgame content with this. So I'm willing to give it like, at least like the bottom of E tier. Okay, next up we have Still Hunt. Still Hunt. So Still Hunt, it's good for two things, right? Still Hunt is obviously very, very good for nuking an enemy with crit damage from a long range, right? It's like a buffed Izzy. If you have Nighthawk and you have a full charge of Still Hunt, there's almost nothing mini boss wise that will survive a Nighthawk Still Hunt to the face, right? So it's obviously very good for that. And the second thing Still Hunt is good for is boss damage burst, right? I think it's actually quite overrated by a lot of people for just raw damage output if you're using it by itself. So if you go to Still Hunt here and you go ahead and take a look, the DPS of Still Hunt is 7.3k. A lot of people are comparing Still Hunt to like rockets or crossbows or whatever, using it as an individual damage option. Even with Sniper's Meditation stack, if you are never reloading Still Hunt, you're never manually reloading Still Hunt, it assumes you at least pick up 2 orbs per mag and you're constantly shooting this thing. The DPS is still I say only in quotation marks, but only 7.3k. So the thing is not at the territory of like 13k, of 15k, of 10k that a lot of these other top options are going to be competing at. So Still Hunt's main claim to fame that it does actually excellently well is burst. It's that single shot, that single initial shot that you get off, and then you can get a lot of orbs from like shooting rockets or shooting heavy sniper or whatever. And then once you get all those orbs back to fill up another meter of Still Hunt, you can instantly pop it for another huge amount of burst. Okay, so that's really what Still Hunt is really, really excellent for. Of course, it's still a good sustained option. I'm not saying that it's not, but it's just not as good as some of the top tier stuff. And so I'm going to go ahead and put Still Hunt into the A tier. I think with that description, I think it's fairly reasonable to put it into the A tier. It's not universally insanely meta warping because we have a lot of other crazy sustained damage options now. And we have a lot of crazy burst damage options as well. And then of course, it's like really good for roam. So obviously it's going to be placed over Izzy, which is of course in the B tier. Okay, coming up next on our list, we have Sturm. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Control F here. We're going to go Sturm. And Sturm, unfortunately, is basically, it's a 120 hand cannon, which is not a great start, right? And then second, it's an extremely unremarkable exotic effect, and it's purely single target. The only time Sturm was ever good was when you could have like a Together Forever weapon on, and you could like buff your ability damage while you had Sturm out. So like your throwing hammer would do like 4 times damage or something like that. So it was relevant, I guess, for that, but that's a bug and that's been patched. So Sturm is now basically just worse than a legendary kinetic hand cannon. There's no reason to ever use it, and I'm just going to go ahead and put it into the F tier. I don't think that's very surprising for anybody. Okay, Sunshot. Ooh, Sunshot. I might get crucified for this one. Sunshot, unfortunately, in the modern era where you're using exotic primaries, especially in like -50 content, this thing is just not that good. Like it staggers pretty hard. But the amount of scorch that it inflicts is extremely minimal compared to something like a Skyburners or even like a Burning Ambition incandescent weapon. Like this thing applies so little scorch, and its ability to kill individual targets at like low power content is fairly poor. It's fairly poor. And it's very unable to do chaining. At like really low power levels of content where enemies have a little bit more health. And so Sunshot, unfortunately, I am going to have to place it into the E tier. It just does not hold up to modern standards compared to something like a Necrochasm, compared to something like a Kvostov, or compared to something like a Graviton Lance, or even a Collective. Sunshot just isn't really in the same category as those weapons, especially given the artifact support doesn't really, benefit Sunshot much at all. And so yeah, Sunshot, I'm going to have to unfortunately give it an E tier. Certainly an exotic feeling hand cannon, and certainly the splash perk does more damage than like a standard solar hand cannon would, but it's not by that much. Certainly a very consistent weapon to use and a very loved weapon, over time, but I do think even like solo and challenge players would consider Sunshot to be a little bit power crept at this point and would probably rather use a different exotic primary in the energy slot at this time. Next up, we have Suros Regime. So Suros Regime is a kinetic single target no splash perk auto rifle, which has 2 modes, and neither mode is particularly, impressive or anything. It has like its own version of high impact reserves, and its catalyst gives you a 50% to restore some health when you kill an enemy. Unfortunately, this is, I would say, the overall package is legitimately just worse than like a solid kinetic auto rifle like Skadelock or something like that, which has access to Veteran's Wisdom, Exhausting Shockwave. You have access to Shootaloo, you have access to Attrition Orbs, you have access to Kinetic Tremors, all of which are higher utility than anything on Suros Regime. And so unfortunately, I'm gonna have to give Suros Regime an F tier, worse than Legendary in my opinion, and we're gonna go ahead and move on right below that to Sweet Business. Sweet Business is essentially like the Heir Apparent of the auto rifles, where it needs ramp up, and even when it is ramped up, its DPS is terrible. This thing provides basically like no benefit over like a standard kinetic auto rifle. In fact, if anything, it's just worse. So I'm gonna go ahead and put it into the F tier. This thing hits like a barrage of wet noodles if you're in any sort of content that has any sort of like low power delta in it. Okay, next up we have Symmetry. Symmetry is a little interesting, and not for the reason that you think, okay? So Symmetry on its own is pretty terrible, right? It's a rapid fire scout, which is not a bad frame, but its exotic perk requires you to hit 20 crits to get the maximum benefit out of it, right? Dynamic Charge has 20 total stacks, so you need to get 20 crits in order to get the maximum benefit out of this thing. 20 scout rifle crits in endgame content is a massive tempo killer, right? It's a massive ask for any sort of primary to ask you. And then what's your reward for getting these crits? It is hipfire seeking explosive arc weapon bolt thingies, which is like, they don't even do that much damage. And the only thing that's even remotely interesting about this weapon, besides the fact that it was able to kill your teammates in the past, is that you can stack and discharge bolt charge with the arc seekers, and they take weapon scaling benefits for some reason. And so you can get some pretty crazy numbers out of bolt charge. It apparently also triple stacks with like Well of Radiance caster, like bolt charge discharge, as well as like Storm's Keep bolt charge discharge for some reason, which is kind of interesting. So you get like a triple bolt charge proc on an enemy, and 2 of them will be normal, and 1 of them will be like your Symmetry bolt charge thing. So I'll probably test like the primary DPS of this, but I have very little faith that even with flashover that this will be any sort of viable strategy, but it's certainly like a unique interaction. And so for that, I'll give it like an E tier, I suppose, but it's definitely pushing it. It's definitely pushing it. And I would say in most endgame content, or all endgame content, to be honest with you, you'd much rather use like, I don't know, like the EQ scout, like Voltaic Shade or something like that over this. But yeah, it's kind of interesting, the effect, even though I'm pretty sure it's a bug. Next up, we have Teraba. Teraba is honestly not that bad. The Ravenous Beast change to give it like 50% solar resist, which happened within like the last couple years or so, made it certainly more enticing. Obviously, Risk Runner's arc damage resist is a lot easier to proc, but Ravenous Beast is pretty decent primary DPS for just mowing down red bars. So if you want like a single target primary, like I feel like Teraba's not terrible. If you're gonna use like a single target primary, I feel like Teraba's better than the stuff in the F tier at least. Obviously pairs well with PKs if you want to use that for roam for whatever reason. I mean, it also has high Emogen stat as well. So it's definitely bordering between E and F tier, but it's certainly better than like a legendary SMG, like similar tier to like Barrow-Dyad, I suppose. So I'll put it in the E tier and we'll leave it there. Next up, we have Telesto. Telesto, unfortunately, as funny of a meme gun as it is, this thing is terrible. This thing's damage profile is significantly worse than like a typical legendary fusion. You need to activate Harbinger's Pulse, which is already a multi-kill counter requirement. You need to activate it 3 times to get a Void Portal. And the Void Portal is just pure LARP. Or like it just rains down Void Bolts. And I'm not even, whatever. Telesto's F tier, okay? Telesto's F tier. If we're being real, it's F tier. Telesto's the type of gun, it's either F tier or it's S tier if you're joking around. And this is a very serious matter. We're not joking around with this tier. So Telesto, unfortunately, it's going to go in the F tier. Okay, next up, we have Tessellation. Tessellation, in my opinion, is kind of underrated, but it's mostly like a speedrunning weapon because it consumes your grenade, right? So it's very ammo efficient. It doesn't really like use any ammo when it does this. And it just sends out like a nuclear bomb that travels in a straight line. And the nuclear bomb is really, really great in speedrunning. It has a secondary explosion as well that's very, very capable of cleaning up any ads that the first explosion wasn't able to kill. And so, yeah, Tessellation is just a very consistent weapon for nuking a group of enemies from like a fair distance away that you can kind of preempt and charge over time. And so, yeah, really, really good for that. It's also great for killing mini-bosses. For example, in Shattered Throne speedruns, people use it to kill the captain. It does like a big chunk of damage to that guy. And so, yeah, Tessellation is good at killing mini-bosses, is good at killing groups of ads. And you can also even use it for burst damage against a boss. If you're Transcendent, it does actually fairly decent swap DPS, especially against bosses that don't like being crit. And so I'm going to go ahead and put Tessellation into the C tier. It'd definitely be lower C tier compared to something like an Alethonym or like an Anarchy. But it's not the worst, right? It's not the worst. And I think it's more deserving of being in the C tier, certainly more than something like an Arbalest. Okay, coming up next, we have the Chaperone. Now the Chaperone, it's actual DPS if you use the kinetic synthesis thing where you're sitting underneath a boss and repeatedly critting it and just picking up the bricks and reloading Chaperone. It's actually not bad, right? With triple tap kinetic synthesis, it's around 5k, which is around Duality and it has infinite total damage. The only problem with this is that there is basically no scenario in this game where you're sitting directly underneath a boss and repeatedly critting it with Chaperone and just picking up the bricks. Maybe like Koragos, I guess, but like even then, you're just basically never using this thing. So while Duality, I can kind of see it being used in some cases because you can still use it like a slug and be at range. And it's probably better than Chaperone for dealing with like roam as well. I don't really see a reason why you would ever use Chaperone. So Chaperone, I'm going to place it in the E tier. I think Duality, we can make the argument that Duality should also be in the D tier, but I think there's like a little bit of a distinction between them when it comes to use case. Chaperone, this whole like triple tap kinetic synthesis thing, it's a really weird scenario. Like you have to be directly underneath a boss so that you're picking up the bricks constantly. And I guess someone has to be diving so that you're hitting your crits all the time while you're directly underneath the boss. So a bit of a weird situation, but yeah, that's what I think of Chaperone. Next up, we have the Colony. So the Colony is unfortunately, unsurprisingly, going to be in the F tier. Like this thing is just worse than like a heavy wave frame for just raw ad clear. It's just not lethal enough. The little like spider drones that it spawns, they can chain, but they don't do very much damage. And this thing is obviously terrible for boss DPS as well. So I think it being in the F tier is not a surprise to anyone. And we're going to go ahead and move on to another fan favorite, a fan classic, which is the Fourth Horseman. The Fourth Horseman, let's go ahead and look at its raw DPS as a sustained weapon. If you're going to just shoot all 4 of its mags and you're manually reloading back to back, it's still 4.3k. So I don't have the swap DPS tab updated right now. Fourth Horseman is pretty high up on that list. But yeah, Fourth Horseman, it's still a classic. I mean, you can argue Merciless is a much better weapon than Fourth Horseman with Particle for roam for killing mini bosses. But in speedrunning and stuff like that, you can use it for boss burst. It's still used, for example, in like solo throne speedruns in order to kill all 3 of the knights really quickly with Rain of Fire. The refill effect, it was very helpful for that as well. And Fourth Horseman, while Tessellation has kind of taken half its job from it, but I would certainly still place it in the same tier as Tessellation, even if on the whole, it's maybe like a little bit worse of a weapon. Okay, next we have the Huckleberry. So the Huckleberry is an interesting option. Apparently the Huckleberry is... Oh, why is it? Okay. It just says Huckleberry on the spreadsheet instead of the Huckleberry, but whatever. So the Huckleberry is a bit interesting. When I think of the Huckleberry, what comes to mind is it has 100 ammo gen. It's one of the better 100 ammo gen primaries out there. It has scaling, ramping fire rate, and of course it has pre-nerf rampage. So at 3 stacks, it has a 66% damage increase. The problem with Huckleberry, it also has kinetic tremors as well. So the question then becomes, are you willing to have slightly more ammo gen than something like a Kvostov or something like a Necro in a sandbox where we already are kind of overflowing with ammo and sacrifice a lot of your splash damage potential. Because Huckleberry, no doubt, is very, very high single target DPS, but just doesn't have like a real splash damage perk, right? Kinetic Tremors is kind of a splash damage perk, but compared to like Necro's Curse Thrall, Chain Explosions, and like Kvasov's Bouncing Bullets, it's really not a competition when it comes to like splash damage efficiency. So Huckleberry, the answer is probably going to be no. And so Huckleberry, we do kind of have to place it in the E tier. It's certainly a more respectable primary in the E tier compared to some of the other stuff here, but it's not deserving of being in the D tier. Certainly, there's not really any real reason to take it in endgame content, even though it does have 100 ammo gen. Next up, we have the Jade Rabbit. So the Jade Rabbit is a kinetic high-impact scout rifle. It has a modified version of Firefly, I suppose, and it has a micro missile thing that you can prep. Unfortunately, these things just take forever to stack, and it's a high-impact scout rifle. So I don't think I need to tell you that this thing is probably just worse than like a legendary kinetic stasis or strand scout rifle that is of decent caliber, and so I'm going to go ahead and put this thing into the F tier. Next up, we have the Lament. The Lament is an interesting one. So the Lament recently got Burning Ambition as a catalyst, and the Scorch Ticks actually do restore HP. So you do get a little bit extra sustain compared to how much you used to get before it got its catalyst. Now, what about its damage? Let's go ahead and look at the Lament damage. The Lament, and we're going to go ahead and filter by swords. Where does the Lament fit into this equation? So unfortunately, the Lament is not as good as basically all of the modern legendary swords. It's also worse than Wolfsbane, and this assumes that you have Dawn Chorus, right? If you don't have Dawn Chorus, the Lament is significantly worse. It is at 4.6 KDPS, which for reference is worse than Duality, which for reference is worse than Chaperone. And so if this thing is losing to special weapons, not a great look, not a great look. And so it's certainly better off than it used to be, right? The Lament, this over here, Swordstorm combo, Lucent Blades ×3, Burning Ambition, combination Argent Blade. This is not bad. Like 4.6 KDPS is not bad. So I'm not going to put it in the F tier, but it's certainly kind of like a sleeper situation where it does clearable damage. It does clearable damage. But even if you're trying to go for something that's easy to use, there's just better options. So we're going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. Okay, next up we have the Last Word. Unfortunately, the Last Word is a kinetic non-splash hand cannon. Its minor DPS in 1 mag is not bad, for sure. And the Envious Assassin effect is kind of cool with Lucky Pants, right? It actually does a fairly decent amount of damage with Lucky Pants. You can get a lot of shots off with Lucky Pants. The triple overflow helps a lot. Unfortunately, even with Lucky Pants, this thing is not viable at all for boss damage. So we're going to go ahead and put the Last Word into the F tier. There is no reason to use the Last Word in PvE. It is just worse than other kinetic legendary hand cannons, I would say. And so yeah, F tier is fairly reasonable, I think, for the Last Word. Okay, next up we have the Manticore. The Manticore. So the Manticore, it actually does have a lot of synergy with like the Void Artifact. It gives you Void Overshield. It does like fairly decent minor DPS. The only problem with this thing is like it's kind of a LARP weapon, right? You're kind of just hovering in the air and like shooting enemies. Even if you get like the amplified-esque effect where like enemies are less accurate at targeting you, you're literally just decreasing your mobility just to like hover and shoot enemies with like a single target SMG. So it's kind of a ridiculous proposition if you're trying to like optimize an endgame loadout to be taking this thing. So yeah, in my opinion, it's E tier, right? It's not F tier because like the damage profile is actually pretty decent, but it's certainly nowhere near good enough to warrant the playstyle that it requires you to adopt. And there's other Void SMGs, like legendary Void SMGs, that are certainly of similar caliber that do not require you to hover in the air as a flying monster. Okay, next up we have the Navigator. The Navigator in previous seasons probably would have been B or A tier. Unfortunately, these days the Navigator has fallen off quite a bit because the main reason for Navigator, of course, was creating grapple points for grapple melee damage. And there's only really one place where for solo content you would prioritize using grapple melee, and that is on Caretaker. And these days, that's not a very major like use case, I suppose. The Navigator is still used in speedrunning sometimes to create grapple points for like mechanics. And it's obviously good in like contest level content or like 5 feet type content. If you need to heal a teammate or give them Woven Mail or give yourself Woven Mail or apply Sever, it's like a high utility weapon. But these use cases are kind of few and far in between. And I'm honestly not even sure I want to give it C tier. It would be like high D tier. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the D tier. Pretty crazy fall from grace, but I think people saw this coming when Grapple Melee got nuked. Obviously, Navigator is specifically, in tandem with that damage strategy. And if that damage strategy falls, then the associated tools will obviously take a hit as well. All right, next up we have Prospector. Prospector is unfortunately bad news for Prospector Nation, Prospector lovers around the world. If we go ahead and filter by all weapons and we sort by Prospector, we filter by Prospector. Yeah, that's not good. 73k total for that's just not good, is it? That's just not good. Okay. So Prospector, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the F tier. I mean, if you want to compare it to Heavy GL, you can. We can go Grenade Launcher. And we can head up over here. We have heavy GLs here, Envious Honing, like Waveframe, 4.3k, Adaptive GL, 4.4k, Even Micro Missile like Slide Shot Honing is 4.4k. Envious Honing Rapid Fire, you have 4.5k. Yeah, really no contest here. Prospector is literally worse than Legendary Heavy GLs, and those are already in the dumps this season. So really just going to be in the F tier. Next up, we have Queenbreaker. So Queenbreaker is actually very, very similar to Sleeper in terms of damage profile. So if you go and sort by linear here, go ahead and look at Queenbreaker and Sleeper. They're right next to each other. Their DPS is within spitting distance, within hundreds of each other. And their total damage is like, it's a 10,000 off, right? It's like under 10,000 off. So very, very small difference in their damage profiles. The difference is Sleeper has a much more forgiving crit value than Queenbreaker does. Much, much more forgiving crit value. And so Queenbreaker, if you're on that 3-burst mode, if you don't have a div, it's going to be kind of hard to hit all 3 of your crits on bosses with moving tiny crits. Whereas Sleeper, even if you had a body, and the single shot itself is also easy to land and compared to like the 3-shot, you could argue that Sleeper is just like a higher QL weapon than Queenbreaker for a similar damage profile. And so yeah, Queenbreaker, I'm going to go ahead and also put that into the E tier. Not really deserving of being any higher than that. Similar category as Sleeper Simulant. Okay, next up we have the Wardcliff Coil. The Wardcliff Coil has only one real purpose, and that is to do damage to Duality and any other sort of boss that's classed as like an elite or not a boss. And so yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier because that is a very, very restricted niche for a weapon to have. Should I zoom out so we can, yeah, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we can still see everything. Hopefully the text is still readable for you mobile users out there, or you've memorized what the tiers say. But yeah, Wardcliff Coil, really no use outside of just doing damage to Duality, and it is worse than Legendary Rockets in every other respect. And so I do have to give it E tier just for like the tiny use case. Otherwise it would probably be in the F tier. If you're curious how much damage Wardcliff Coil does, I suppose, with Argent Ordnance, here's your answer, 2.4k. Terrible, terrible, terrible. Okay, next up we have Third Iteration. Third Iteration, the famous marking scout rifle from the Edge of Fate, the first Heat prototype-esque weapon in the game. Unfortunately, this thing is extremely slow when it comes to gameplay loop. If you want to mark a target, you have to ADS on it for a while, then you have to mark it, then you have to shoot it with this kind of like spread shot scout rifle nonsense. For a scout rifle, its range is like kind of questionable as well because it shoots like a spread shot if you're rapid firing it. So a bit of a weird weapon. It's still used sometimes in solo stuff for like Tormentors, for example. Raw First Encounter, people use the ADS mode to like insta-pop Tormentor shoulders, which I suppose is a valid use case for it. But that's a very, very small niche. And even then, you could just use like a different weapon to pop those shoulders. And so I'm going to go ahead and put Third Iteration into the E tier. I think that's a fair placement for it, given that for other purposes, I would say it's probably worse than a typical Legendary Scout Rifle of the modern caliber and modern standards. Okay, next up we have Thorn. Thorn has really nothing going for it, to be honest, in endgame PvE. It has no real splash spread, and the Soul Devourer stuff, like the little remnants that flow toward you, don't even, like, I feel like they should, like, heal you. They don't really, like, heal you, to my understanding. Like, yeah, nothing here says that they heal you. And, the poison on hit is, like, not even really that much damage if you have Soul Devourer active in, like, especially in lower power delta content. And the poison on hit is, like, kind of cool, I guess, but, like, you can't even really use it for Envious because it lasts literally 2 seconds. So yeah, not a really big fan of Thorn. It is probably just worse than like a standard like top slot legendary hand cannon. So I'm just going to go ahead and put it into the F tier for PvE. Okay, next up we have Thunderlord. Thunderlord, unfortunately, yeah, they nerfed this thing after it already became unusable and it was already not very good. So Thunderlord, assuming you reload once post nerf, 3k, 100k. That is terrible. That's terrible. And of course, machine guns don't really have any support when it comes to boss DPS in the artifact. Obviously, you have stuff like heavy ordnance regeneration and stuff like that, which you can use with machine guns in the artifact if you're using them for roam. But even there, Thunderlord, I mean, you could use like an arc LMG and achieve probably sort of similar results, or just use another heavy weapon that's not a machine gun. So Thunderlord, despite being like really terrible for boss DPS, I could see being used over like a legendary arc LMG for like an arc build, because it will have like significantly higher DPS, and obviously it builds bolt charge, has a ramping fire rate, and it's still, if you're getting kills with it, those lightning strikes are still like fairly good for ad clear. I mean, Thunderlord, before it was known as like a boss DPS weapon, was certainly known for its ad clearing prowess. So I feel like putting it in the F tier would be like a little disingenuous. So I'll go ahead and put it into the E tier. Okay, next up we have Tiku's Divination. Tiku's Divination, honestly, it's an on-hit weapon, one of the first, I guess, solid on-hit exotic primaries that we received in like year 4, I believe. And it's not bad, but the problem is that this Sacred Flame stuff does not synergize at all with anything in any of the artifacts or subclasses. It doesn't apply Scorch. It's not real Scorch. It's like fake Scorch. And the Sacred Flame detonation is not an ignition. And so if it was, people would use it with Dawn Chorus, and they would use it with Fulmination, and it would be actually pretty good. Unfortunately, it doesn't. And so Tiku's, the only claim to fame that it has is that I suppose it does slightly higher DPS maybe than like Hierarchy if you were to pair it with like 3 Hierarchy rings, but at that point, I don't know why you would even use Tiku's. So this thing doesn't really have any real use. I mean, over a regular Solar Legendary bow, it certainly is better on hit, especially if you don't have like a Hierarchy ring to pair with you. So I suppose I should give it E tier. But besides that, yeah, there's no real reason to use Tiku's in in-game content. Okay, next up we have Tommy's Matchbook. Tommy's Matchbook. Let's go ahead and look at the cell on Compendium for Tommy's Matchbook. Yeah, Tommy's Matchbook, despite the fact that it's an auto rifle, so it does gain some benefits from the artifact, this thing is way too slow to ramp. It also deals damage to you, which is, you know, if you look at like Touch of Malice and stuff like that, some people have tried to build around it in in-game content, but I feel like a weapon that deals damage to you and the payoff is that like it scorches enemies when you shoot them is like not great. I mean, just use Skyburner's Oath, bro. Just, if you want to use a weapon that scorches on hit and is like a chill weapon that you can kind of just dump into groups of enemies and get ignitions, just use Skyburner's Oath, man. Like Tommy's Matchbook is like, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's better than like a legendary. I kind of want to put it F tier, to be honest with you, but it's probably realistically like low E tier. It has a better damage profile than like a standard solar auto, but it's really not by much. It's really not by much. Honestly, Tommy's and Skyburners being in the same tier, Skyburner should definitely be higher, but it's okay. You know, the E tier is quite wide. It's kind of like a definitional tier. It's where like, you know, it's gonna be better than like really terrible like detriments to your loadout, but it's just not really any real endgame use. So obviously the E tier is gonna be the largest tier. But okay, next up we have Touch of Malice, which I literally just talked about. So let's go ahead and look at Touch of Malice. Touch of Malice, you might be wondering, with Precision Instrument, what is the deal with Touch of Malice? What is its DPS compared to Outbreak? Good question. It is 2.8k. That is terrible. That is terrible. By modern standards. I mean, it's decently high for an exotic primary, I suppose, but don't use Touch of Malice for boss DPS. Please don't. Just use Hierarchy if you want to use. Like, okay, let me show you something. Actually, go to Hierarchy of Needs right now without Mobius Quiver. Without Mobius Quiver, Hierarchy of Needs with Argent Quiver and Fireteam Scaling hits 4.4k, 4.4k DPS if you have other people using it in your team. So just there's no reason to ever use Touch of Malice for DPS. And then for like ad clear, it's a mostly kind of, I mean, the Blight is sort of splash, I suppose, but it's a mostly single target weapon. It's a mostly single target weapon, and it's a scout rifle. And so I kind of have to give it E tier, right? Like it's, I suppose it like out damages Outbreak for like single target primary DPS. So I'll give it some flowers for that, but really it's gonna be like lower E tier. Like there's no real reason to use like Touch of Malice in endgame content. Okay, next up we have Tractor Cannon. Tractor Cannon, and those of you who saw this tier list, you know, last season, are probably not going to be surprised. Tractor Cannon is the only S tier weapon in the game, and you could argue honestly that it's A tier because Tractor Cannon is not really used as much in roam content anymore. It was used before with like melee builds with like Throwing Hammer or whatever, but it's not honestly that important to use it in a roam content build anymore. If you're using like a melee build, you'd probably rather use something else. But in every other piece of content, in speedrunning, it is, you know, S tier. In challenge content, it's S tier. In certain solos, it's S tier. Tractor Cannon has been so meta for so long that like people don't even view this weapon as meta warping. But imagine, I was talking to my friend Spider the other day, and imagine if we had a meta without Tractor Cannon. Imagine a sandbox without Tractor Cannon. It would literally change how people do boss damage on almost every boss in optimal fire teams. Like everything, the game would be warped completely, right? Fafnir would be looked at differently. Tether would be looked at differently. Felwinter would gain more priority, right? So the fact that just not having Tractor in the game would completely warp the game is just enough, I think, to put it in the S tier. It's just, we've taken Tractor as a given for so long that we don't really tend to think of it as a meta warping option because it's just always been there. It's never changed. It's always been there, right? But don't take it for granted. You know, love your Tractor today. Hug your Tractor today. It's in the S tier. Okay, you can make an argument for high A tier, but otherwise, not to spoil anything, but like if Tractor wasn't in the S tier, nothing would be in the S tier would be empty. Which, you know, I suppose nothing being in the S tier is somewhat of like an emblematic thing to end the game on. But you know, I wanted to have something in the S tier, and if you're gonna pick something, it's gonna be Tractor out of the 7 things that are on the screen so far in the top 2 tiers. Okay, next up we have Traveler's Chosen. Traveler's Chosen's only real niche is getting 10 kills and then instantly restoring all of your abilities when you swap subclasses. This has been used before to some extent in some challenges. I haven't seen anybody put forth like a legitimate use case for this weapon in the recent past. And so as a result, I'm going to go ahead and put Traveler's Chosen in the E tier. Certainly that like regeneration effect is kind of cool, I suppose, and not something that any like legendary primary has access to, but it's so niche that it kind of has to be in the E tier. Even though the application is like, I guess, a bit more potent than a lot of the other stuff in the E tier. Okay, next up we have Trespasser. Trespasser, unfortunately, this thing is just like objectively worse than like an Arc Legendary sidearm. No Volt, bro. They gave it Tunnel Vision as a catalyst. This is a single target Arc sidearm that has an on-kill reload effect. And they could have easily given it Volt Shot as a kill reload effect as its catalyst. It would have been perfect, but they gave it Tunnel Vision. So I guess they want it to be like a PvP only type of weapon. Obviously the Unrepentant Burst is still pretty good. They can like one-shot red bars in low power content, but you're killing one enemy at a time in low power content. It's just like, that's terrible, right? So I'm going to go ahead and give this an F tier. I do think it is just worse than a typical arc, solid arc sidearm that is legendary in rarity. Okay, next up we have Trinity Ghoul. Trinity Ghoul has fallen off a little bit because there is a lot of... So Trinity Ghoul used to be used in speedrunning a lot, and even in some challenges in order to kill a bunch of red bars really quickly, especially red bars that are spread out. We have so many ad clear options in this game now that are capable of easily killing red bars that are spread out that you don't really need to use Trinity Ghoul for that anymore. You can. I think it's fine, right? I think it's still a good use case for it, but it's definitely fallen off a lot compared to where it used to be. So Trinity Ghoul, I'm going to go ahead and place it into the D tier. It's got a fairly minimal role, I would say, compared to how often people would use it before in like solos, low man's challenges, etc., and speedruns. But it's certainly still got some use. And in certain like level speedruns, you'll see people use Trinity Ghoul to hit chains of enemies that are grouped up. All right, so that's enough about Trinity Ghoul. Let's go ahead and talk about Truth Nuke. Truth Nuclear. Okay, so real quick to contextualize this discussion, let's go ahead and look at Truth in the Fireteam DPS ranking. It's going to be at 9k with Prototype Truth Seeker pre-stacked, Reaper's Tithe times 4 pre-stacked, Argent Ordnance. This is very high, given that every single other weapon above this requires some level of setup or like a special subclass or something like that. So Truth, you have to give it some flowers for being the highest sustained DPS option that doesn't require any sort of galley, any sort of pre-stacking, doesn't require you to be on Void Hunter, doesn't require like Slide Shot, doesn't require any of this weird shit, right? Truth is just like on its own. This is just by itself, raw dumping, Reaper's Tithe, Prototype Truth Seeker on its own, 9k DPS, right? That's pretty good. That's pretty respectable. And this doesn't include the fact that you can use like Shoot to Loot or whatever. This is just a raw reserve, right? 120k, a little bit on the lower side when it comes to total damage, but the DPS is very, very respectable. So you gotta have to give some flowers to Truth Nuke, even if it's not the most optimal thing ever in a full Fireteam setup. It's used in solos all the time, and it's used in challenges all the time, and of course in fire teams and like LFGs, it's still excellent Fireteam DPS, right? No doubt about that. So Truth, we're gonna give Truth a nice solid A tier slot. It's not always the best thing, right? But it's very good, right? It's very good, and it's certainly better than 1k in the good enough role. 1k you can argue is like a bit easier to use, no pre-stacking or anything like that. But Truth Nuke is pretty strong. Who knew? Who knew? Okay, let's go ahead and move on to Turncoat next. Turncoat is an interesting one. So Turncoat as a regular ad clear weapon is not really anything special. It'd probably be E tier, right? It has some splash, right? Latent power, the unleash power mechanic is kind of cool, right? You get some void over shield. Obviously has some synergy with the artifact as well. So not a bad ad clear weapon. However, Turncoat obviously has the bug where it increases explosive damage from like rockets and micro missiles by 30%. 30%. Rockets are very good. There are some bugs in the past that have boosted certain weapon families by a certain percentage, and those weapon families were not good to begin with, so it didn't matter. Rockets are very good. Rockets are very good to begin with. And so boosting Hezin's damage by 30%, if you go ahead and look at the option over here, outside of like Mobius Quiver and like, Guidance Ring ×3 and this hyper optimized like crossbow swap stuff, this is really high, right? Turncoat Transfer, Cluster Elemental Honing, or Cluster Aggregate Charge, 14k. This is really high. This is really high DPS. And so Turncoat, you kind of can't ignore that. Obviously, it's very little use outside of that. And this is like a very situational thing and probably going to only be used in speedruns and some really weird low man cases. But it is common enough that I would say that is deserving of being at least in the C tier. I would say boosting, Hezin damage by like 30% is more, useful than like Arbalest or like anything Buried Bloodline can do. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put that into the C tier. Definitely not worthy of being in the B tier, but I think C tier is a fair placement for that kind of unique glitch that Turncoat has access to, which I assume will not be patched because it's not insanely game breaking or anything, but it's kind of cool, I suppose. Okay, next on my list, I have Two-Tailed Fox. Two-Tailed Fox. So Two-Tailed Fox is basically just a boss DPS weapon because for ad clear, there's just better rockets out there. You can use like Galley, you can use just like other non-rockets as well. So yeah, Two-Tailed Fox is basically just a boss DPS weapon. And Two-Tailed Fox, obviously every single shot you can get an ignition if you have Ember of Ashes. And so with Dawn Chorus, it actually hits 4.8k, which is honestly, in my head, I thought it was a little bit higher. This is actually not very good. Don't worry, I wasn't gonna make an argument for Two-Tailed Fox to be in like D tier or anything, but yeah, I thought it was actually even a little bit better than that. So yeah, Dawn Chorus, even with Dawn Chorus, Two-Tailed Fox is just it's not very good. It's not very good. So let's go ahead and put Two-Tailed Fox in the E tier and not really think too much about it. It's clearable damage, like I mentioned. It's kind of like Sleeper, it's kind of like Queenbreaker. Deserves to be in the E tier, not in the F tier, but certainly not any higher than that. Okay, next we have Vergilus Curve, or maybe Vergila Curve. I don't know which one it is, but Vergilus Curve. Vergilus Curve, this thing is used in endgame content for two things. It's not used for head clear, right? It's not used for roam because it's a bow. It's a bow, and every single shot, makes a crystal or whatever, as long as you're chaining kills, and that's cool and all, but the tempo is pretty slow. So it's used for two things. Number one, it's used in like solo Atheon to make a little hiding spot so you don't get shot by the gatekeeper. And number two, it's used in speedrunning to create like little crystals that you can line off of for like certain scenarios. That being said, those are pretty niche. Those are pretty niche scenarios, and they're definitely more niche than a lot of the stuff in the D tier, I would say. Like, it's certainly not in Trinity Ghoul or New Malpais or like New Land Beyond tier or Kvostov tier. So Vergless, I'm going to go ahead and put it into the E tier. It's certainly got more endgame applicability than a lot of the stuff in the E tier, but it's a little too weak to be in the D tier with some of the other stuff that I put in there. So this next placement might be the most controversial one on this list, but if you've been following along the reasoning on this tier list and kind of acknowledging the endgame gameplay that I'm talking about, you might not be that surprised by this placement. Vex Mythoclast is going to be going into the D tier. Now, Vex Mythoclast is, like I said, strong in isolation, but minimal role. There are not that many places in endgame content where Vex Mythoclast is the optimal pick to choose when you're going into that content, right? Don't get me wrong, it's a workhorse. It is probably the strongest ever single target primary in the context of this sandbox because of Particle. However, its niche in endgame content is still small. Because think about it like this. In endgame content, if you are an optimal endgame player, which is what this tier list is supposed to represent, you're not taking an exotic primary very much. And if you are, generally you're looking for an exotic primary that has some sort of utility, has some sort of survivability, or some really, really excellent splash. All of the exotic primaries in the D tier meet that requirement. Vex Mythoclast doesn't meet any of those requirements. It's just very, very strong as a raw damage profile weapon. And while it does work with Particle, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, right? Because it doesn't count for auto rifle interactions, for example, like targeting autoloader or like sustained fire. So it's kind of like an individually boxed in workhorse. So think about it like this, even in content where you would want to take an exotic primary, like a Conquest or maybe like a Vanguard alert, right? You think the people who are running Howl of the Storm are going to run Vex Mythoclast instead of like a Fighting Lion or instead of like an Icebreaker? No. You think the people who are running Dawn Chorus are going to run Vex Mythoclast over like a Scorch assisting primary? No. So where does Vex Mythoclast fit into the equation? And the answer is, it's just a workhorse. It's just a vanilla workhorse. It's just a vanilla workhorse. And even the linear mode is like a 6 kill stack counter to get going, which if you look at the other exotic primary requirements in order to activate their exotic effects, a lot of them, their requirements are a lot less steep, even though you could argue like the effect is not as strong for dealing with specifically mini bosses. But then again, you always have other weapons for that. So Vex Mythoclast is certainly not a bad weapon, but I just want people to understand when I place it in this tier, first of all, D tier on this tier list is, you're in the top, like, what, 20% of exotics or something like that, 30% of exotics. So it's not a bad placement by any means, but I just want people to know that in the content that I'm referencing specifically, like endgame gameplay, the places where you take exotic primaries are not that common. And the places where you would take Vex Mythoclast specifically are even smaller. And to be honest with you, to be quite honest with you, if you take Vex Mythoclast with Particle Reconstruction into like -50 content, it sounds like it would hit really hard with all the praise that people give this thing, but it honestly, it's just like a solid auto rifle, essentially. That's what it ends up being. It's a solid auto rifle with a linear alt mode, with very high quality of life because of like calculated balance. So I don't know, it's a good weapon, don't get me wrong, but this is an endgame tier list, and in terms of usability tiers, like usage rate tiers, if you're making an optimal loadout, it just does not deserve to be with anything in the C tier or the B tier or A tier, etc. Okay, next up on our list, we have Vex Caliber. Vex Caliber, it is the Vex Glaive, of course. I think this weapon is a little bit underrated. It is probably the best purely defensive exotic in the game. I mean, you could argue Edge of Action as well, but in endgame content, I think Edge of Action has a little bit of an uptime issue in some of the lower power deltas. Vex Caliber's only issue is that one of its exotic perks, the one where you can like melee something, and if you get a melee kill while you have some sort of overshield, you refresh the entire overshield. That sounds really strong, but in practice and endgame content, unless you're stacking a lot of melee buffs, it's going to be kind of hard to get a melee kill with Vex Caliber. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a little bit hard to activate that overshield refresh effect, but I think the raw defensive power of this, you could put it probably bottom of D, high E tier. Depends on the day, I suppose. In my head, I'm going to put it in like the bottom of D tier, because I think it does have a potential minimal defensive role in endgame content, but no doubt it's like extremely niche, and I wouldn't really argue with you if you wanted it placed into the E tier. Next up, we have Vigilance Wing. Vigilance Wing is actually the exotic weapon that inspired me to create the F tier, because it literally has essentially nothing that helps it in PvE, and it's a 5-burst high-impact kinetic pulse rifle, which is an awful start for a weapon to have in endgame PvE in terms of viability. So yeah, V-Wing, not really much to talk about there. We can move on. Probably the easiest F tier I've ever, kind of placed in my life. And let's go ahead and move to Wave Splitter. Wave Splitter has gotten a lot of praise from people. I did mention in my artifact video that I do think trace rifles, specifically like exotic void trace rifles, will be fairly good with, harsh refraction, because destabilizing rounds is so easy to spread. Volatile rounds is so easy to obtain. And And obviously the Void sandbox is so excellent. And no surprise, I think a lot of people have tried Wave Splitter and it's really, really good with the artifacts. So Wave Splitter, I'm going to go ahead and place it into the C tier. I think it is a step up over the primaries. It has the same ammo economy essentially as like a Collective Obligation or as a Graviton Lance, because Trace Rifles are never going to run out of ammo in the modern sandbox, but it does take it a step higher when it comes to damage profile and consistency, especially when it comes to like on hits. It has attrition orbs, it has ammo gen, it has detonator beam, it has a lot of things going for it that a lot of the stuff in the D tier doesn't. Is it as good as Acquire? No, it's not as versatile. It can't deal with mini bosses as well. Acquire has that hip fire mode. Acquire obviously has that increased precision damage, has increased range. But Wave Splitter is certainly something I would invite people to try, especially if they're already on Tablet of Ruin, which is a pretty solid artifact to begin with. I'm going to zoom out one more time so you guys can see the rest of the tier list, and then we'll zoom back in once we're done with the tier list. Actually, maybe I can squash this a little bit, and then we can zoom back in. Oh, yeah, that'll work. That'll do the trick. Let me just squash this a little bit more. Okay, perfect. Okay, next up we have Whirling Ovation. So Whirling Ovation. So unfortunately, this thing was never really that good for damage. I know people were kind of trialing it as an alternative to Parasite, something that you could like use for range with like Mint and like maybe like a Solar Rocket Pulse or something like that. Unfortunately, Mint's era is kind of over. It's been nuked into the ground, and even if it hadn't been nuked into the ground, there's a lot of better options these days. So this thing doesn't really surge match with any like really powerful Strand legendary weapons, or really any really powerful Solar's legendary weapons to begin with. On top of that, Split Surges is not the greatest thing ever unless you're running Sanguine, and even if you are running Sanguine, 4-3, this thing doesn't really outperform Parasite. So there's no real reason to use Whirling Ovation. I think the only place Whirling Ovation is ever relevant is maybe like a boss final stand. Like if you've seen the Ron world record, you've probably seen Whirling Ovation being used to like pre-charge and kill Explicator final stand instantly. I could see it being used for something like that. But for the most part, that's like super niche. That's so niche that I'm honestly not even going to give it D tier. This thing is kind of just dead in the water. There's no reason to use Whirling Ovation for really any sort of damage strategy these days. And even though it's a cool weapon, I like the concept. It's definitely like an interesting weapon. I'm not going to give it any higher than the E tier, unfortunately. Okay, next up we have Whisper of the Worm. Whisper of the Worm initially was actually going to be placed in the F tier because it is just worse than A499, and the F tier does stay worse than legendaries, and it is what inspired me to come up with this little rule where if a weapon's power level is not actually that low, even if it's worse than the legendary equivalents, I'm not going to put in the F tier because I feel like that's a little disingenuous, right? So Whisper, Sleeper, Queenbreaker, stuff like that didn't end up landing into the F tier, and so Whisper, yeah, I mean, if you just look at its damage, let's go ahead and Jarvis, pull up the Whisper damage, please. Sniper's Meditation, 4.3k, 129k total. This thing used to be considered good total damage and pretty decent DPS. Unfortunately, I mean, it's literally worse than the Helmsman. And then A499 is like, it's not even close, right? It's not even close. Even if you take away DARCI buff, A499, it's not even close. It's not even close between the two of them. So yeah, Whisper, not a great look. Certainly, it is an exotic with a history, with a bit of a legacy, but there's no reason to use this thing over A499 or any sort of modern precision weapon that we've talked about and will talk about when we make the damage meta update video, which will come after I test abilities. Okay, next up, we are almost done, guys. Almost done. Wicked Implement. Wicked Implement is a rapid-fire stasis scout rifle. Has the little creeping attrition perk that allows you to slow on hit and eventually freeze. Makes a bunch of shards. Benefits from picking up shards. Unfortunately, it is a stasis scout rifle. It is a stasis scout rifle, even though it's a rapid-fire, pretty decent frame. This thing, I can't give it more than E tier, right? I do think it is probably better than, even like a decent stasis scout rifle that is of the legendary rarity. But yeah, just generally speaking, there's no reason to ever run a Wicked Implement for endgame PvE. Mostly just because it's like a pretty slow playstyle. Even if you're running a stasis build, there's other weapons that are just higher minor DPS or just more splashy in nature. Next up, we have Winterbite. Winterbite is an interesting weapon. I definitely trialed this thing for glaive melee DPS. I will do more glaive melee DPS testing with Winterbite and other glaives in the future. I don't think they're going to change my mind on Winterbite, certainly. And I do think if you're going to use like a weapon for roam that is like glaive melee-esque, you're probably just going to use Cull's Shadow. And so Winterbite is a bit of a questionable choice. I don't know what you would really ever use this thing for. And so I'm going to go ahead and place it into the E tier. Technically, it is better for glaive melee DPS than like a standard legendary or even a standard exotic special glaive. And so it has some sort of like claim to fame with some respect. And I guess it like freezes on hit or something like that. And it also like can cause shatters while you're meleeing something, but that's really not that impressive of a feat, let's just say. Okay, we have 6 exotics left. Next up, we have Wish Ender. Wish Ender is unfortunately going to be going into the F tier. Wish Ender is an extremely slow draw time bow, and its true side effect doesn't really have that much of a benefit in PvE. I mean, you could use it in like Area to like spot where the enemies are, but nobody's really using Wish Ender for that. I mean, you could just like have people check their radar and stuff like that. So Wish Ender, that's like a very niche use case for Wish Ender. And then the actual damage of Wish Ender is not very good. One for all, unless you're like over penetrating 3 enemies instantly, having to hit 3 separate enemies with a bow is like insane. So like Wish Ender just really just a very, very slow playstyle weapon, very, very slow tempo weapon. And what's the payoff for like, you know, playing into this slow playstyle? Nothing really. It's like a single target weapon basically with like over penetration. So yeah, I would much rather take like a kinetic bow, a legendary kinetic bow with like kinetic tremors or something like that over this weapon if I'm going to use a bow to begin with. Okay, next up we have Wish Keeper. Wish Keeper. We have Wish Ender and we have Wish Keeper. Wish Keeper has kind of a similar problem, right? Like it's a bow, but it requires a 6 stack counter, right? So 6 crits or 6 kills, or like you could kill like 3 elites, I suppose. But like that's a lot to ask for in endgame PvE. Most exotic primaries that people consider to be strong these days are either applying their effects instantly when you start shooting an enemy or require 1 kill or maybe 2 kills. This then requires up to 6, right? And it's a bow. So each kill is at minimum going to be at least 1 bow shot, which is like a draw's worth of time, which is a fair amount of time in endgame content. And then what's your payoff for getting, you know, this whole 6 stack counter filled up? It is a suspend trap on the ground, which is like, it's cool. It looks cool. Don't get me wrong. It's like, you know, green Anarchy. It looks really cool. But the damage that it does is pretty pathetic. And, you know, CC heavy stuff is like not really the forte in the current endgame sandbox. And so I kind of have to place this into the E tier, right? The exotic effect is still unique, right? There's no strand bow, there's no legendary strand bow that can provide the same effect. So it is kind of cool, but certainly I'm not going to be placing it any higher than the E tier. It's just like a cool exotic effect. Next, we have Witherhoard. Witherhoard, another exotic with a bit of a legacy, bit of a history. Unfortunately, Witherhoard is basically just used for envious damage over time ticks now. It's basically just used for Mobius Quiver crossbow rotations. Yeah, that's basically it. That's all Witherhoard is good for. You know, it's like, what is my purpose? It's to pass the salt. So yeah, you're gonna be in the E tier Witherhoard. Not really much to do there for Witherhoard. It's pretty bad for ad clear compared to like an area denial, and sticking enemies directly is like some of the slowest like special DPS you can do in the game. So like, yeah, Witherhoard, pretty bad. Next up, we have Wolfsbane. So Wolfsbane is actually fairly decent, as you may have remembered from the last time I analyzed it on this channel. But if we go ahead and look at modern Wolfsbane numbers with Burning Ambition and with Dawn Chorus, ignore this one up here. This is with Outbreak and Max Nanites, so you can ignore that. I believe this is also with Dawn Chorus as well, if I'm not mistaken, but potentially not. Yeah, that might not be with Dawn Chorus. So yeah, this is with Dawn Chorus. With Dawn Chorus and Burning Ambition, this thing hits 6k DPS, which is pretty high. That's basically above all of like the high tier swords outside of the double damage perk stuff. So pretty good. And this is a fairly easy weapon to use. And the thing is, even if you don't have Burning Ambition and you don't have Dawn Chorus, this thing's DPS is fairly decent and consistent for like a close range option, right? 4.8k, that's fairly decent, fairly respectable. And so, yeah, I mean, the total damage is really, really high. Survivability is good. If you're using it on like a sword boss like Crota or like Herald or something like that, it's fairly decent. It's a fairly decent option, just like a consistent option. So do I think it's good enough to the same degree that 1k is? No. I would say it's something similar to Acry's tier. And so that's exactly where I'm going to place it, because it is explicitly a melee damage option. And even amongst the melee damage bosses, you can micro optimize a little bit more and do more damage than Wolfsbane can afford to do, especially in larger fire team sizes. And even on the whole, you know, 1k has a higher ceiling than Wolfsbane does, outside of like crazy outbreak shit, which is something nobody is really ever going to be doing. So that's it for Wolfsbane, and we have 2 exotics left. I'm not going to continue to zoom out anymore to not disorient the viewers anymore, but we have 2 more exotics left. Worldline 0. Worldline 0 is, by all accounts and purposes, worse than a regular legendary sword for ad clear purposes, arguably, and certainly for damage. It's certainly much worse for damage. So where is Worldline going to go? It's not going to go in the F tier, because even though it's worse than legendaries, it does have a lot of use in speedrunning. Not a lot, but it has some use in speedrunning for blade focus stuff, for breaking crystals, because you don't have to like Ager swap with it, and you can use it in vaults, you can use it in King's Fall. There's a couple places where people use Worldline 0. So I'm going to go ahead and place that into the E tier. Pretty easy placement there. Certainly not deserving of being in the D tier. I don't think it's anywhere near as relevant as a lot of the stuff in the D tier, but it, you know, has some niche purposes. And then finally, we have Xenophage. We're ending things on a whimper. You know, I was hoping to end things on a bang, but Xenophage is really not a very, it's a very vanilla plain weapon. It obviously has Rampage and Chain Reaction now, which is cool. They gave it some catalyst, but this doesn't really change the usability of Xenophage, doesn't really change how it is used. So it's basically just used for oracles in like speedrunning, maybe in low man, solo, stuff like that. You would use Xenophage. But for like regular content, there's not really a reason to use Xenophage if you're just running around endgame content, roam gameplay. Ammo economy is pretty terrible, and even the ad clear potential is just not as splashy, not very good. So I'm going to go ahead and place it into the E tier because it does have some use, you know, for shooting oracles and stuff like that. And it's good for nuking down like a single enemy in at-light content. But besides that, nothing much to say about Xenophage. So that is pretty much it for this exotic weapon tier list. If you're curious about some of my decisions or you want to, you know, revisit my placement logic, you can view the tier list in the description. I will link the spreadsheet there. And if there's any changes, you'll be the first to know if you're watching that spreadsheet, because I'll keep it updated as people find things over time into this final patch of Destiny. But I hope you guys have enjoyed. This is certainly a tier list that I think looks different from most tier lists that I've seen of people that make exotic weapon tier lists, as the vast majority of the game, I would say I think there's like 64% of the game's exotics are in the E and F tier, which are basically, you can merge them together to make one F tier if you want. And yeah, I hope this is a pretty accurate tier list. I've put quite a bit of thought into this. Maybe some of the placements are a little bit controversial, but I think among players that really understand what endgame optimal gameplay tends to look like, I think this tier list is fairly reasonable. Not any crazy controversial takes on this one. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this tier list. I've been talking for like 3 hours or something now, so I'm gonna go and eat food and try not to, you know, have a sore throat. Bye bye.